A single knock at the door changed everything. Daniel Harper had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being alone, raising his son, fixing broken things, keeping the world at arm's length. He'd convinced himself his heart was full enough. Then Evelyn Moore stood on his porch that rainy October night, mascara streaking down her cheeks, and asked him for something impossible. Not money, not comfort, a child. She wanted him to help her create a life, no strings attached, just trust between two broken people. Daniel should have said no, but when you've already lost everything once, fear stops being a good enough reason. Before we begin this journey together, if this story touches your heart, please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's dive in. The rain started just after 3 o'clock, the kind that turned Oregon's October afternoons into something between melancholy and meditation. Daniel Harper stood in his garage workshop, hands black with grease, staring at the disemboweled washing machine that had defeated him for the better part of 2 hours. The problem wasn't mechanical. He'd figured that out 40 minutes ago. The problem was that fixing it meant ordering a part that cost more than the machine was worth, and Mrs. Patterson from Maple Street didn't have that kind of money. Neither did he, truth be told. But he'd find a way. He always did. "Dad!" The voice cut through the steady percussion of rain on the metal roof. "Dad, I'm home." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag that had long ago given up any pretense of cleanliness and walked toward the door connecting the garage to the kitchen. His son stood there, backpack sliding off one shoulder, hair plastered to his forehead from the 30-second sprint between the school bus and the front door. "Hey, buddy." Daniel grabbed a clean towel from the counter and tossed it to him. "How was school?" "Wet." Miles grinned, that crooked smile that still carried echoes of his mother, even after 5 years. He'd been 4 when Sarah died. Now he was 9, and sometimes Daniel looked at him and couldn't remember where the time had gone. "Mr. Peterson said my science project was the best in the class." "The one with the volcano?" "The one with the perfect volcano." Miles corrected, with the solemnity only a 9-year-old could muster over a baking soda explosion. "Jamie's fell apart before it even erupted." "Structural integrity matters," Daniel said, ruffling his son's wet hair. "Just like I taught you." "Just like you taught me," Miles echoed, then frowned. "What's for dinner?" Daniel glanced at the clock above the stove. 4:15. He had Mrs. Patterson's washing machine to finish, or at least to deliver the bad news about. He had 3 other repair jobs stacked in the garage, each one representing someone's broken appliance and his fragile income. He had laundry to do, bills to pay, and a son who needed feeding. "How do you feel about spaghetti?" he asked. "Again?" "I make it different every time." "You make it the same every time," Miles said, but he was smiling. "It's okay. I like your spaghetti." The lie was kind, and Daniel accepted it with the grace of a father who knew his cooking skills peaked at exactly 3 meals: spaghetti, grilled cheese, and something he generously called chicken surprise that was really just whatever chicken parts were on sale with whatever vegetables hadn't gone bad yet. "Spaghetti it is. Go get changed and start your homework." Miles disappeared up the stairs, his footsteps loud in the small house, and Daniel returned to the garage. The washing machine stared at him like an accusation. He pulled out his phone and called the parts supplier he'd been working with for the past 3 years. "Harper's Repair. This is Daniel." "Danny, boy." The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus, who ran a warehouse in Portland and had never once called Daniel by his actual name. "What are you breaking today?" "Trying to fix a Fisher & Paykel front loader. Need a main control board." "Ouch. Those run about $250, $300 depending on the model." "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "That's what I was afraid of." "You want me to check for refurbs? Might find something cheaper." "Would you?" "For you? Sure. But Danny, you got to stop doing charity work. You're running a business, not a nonprofit." Daniel looked out at the rain, at the street beyond his driveway, at the small houses that lined both sides of Riverside Avenue. Everyone here was holding on by their fingernails. Everyone here was one broken appliance away from a crisis. He was just the guy who stood between them and that crisis, and he charged what he could, which was usually less than he should. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. "No, you won't." Marcus laughed. "I'll call you tomorrow if I find anything." The line went dead. Daniel set the phone down and stared at the washing machine for another moment, then made the decision he'd been avoiding. He'd buy the part himself, eat the cost, and tell Mrs. Patterson it was used. She'd never know the difference, and he could sleep at night. The rain intensified, drumming harder against the roof, and Daniel wondered, not for the first time, if this was really all there was. Work and worry, bills and broken things, the endless cycle of fixing what other people couldn't fix while his own life stayed permanently in need of repair. He pushed the thought away. He had a son to feed. By 6 o'clock, the spaghetti was done, and Miles was at the kitchen table with his math homework spread out like a battlefield. Daniel had learned to recognize the signs of frustration: the tight grip on the pencil, the tiny furrow between his eyebrows, the way he'd chew on his bottom lip exactly like Sarah used to do. "You stuck?" Daniel asked, setting a plate in front of him. "Fractions." Miles said the word like it was a curse. "I don't get why we need them." "You need them for everything. Cooking, building, measuring. You don't use fractions." "I use them every single day." Daniel sat down across from him with his own plate. "How do you think I know what size bolt to use, or how much of one chemical to mix with another? It's all fractions." Miles considered this, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but they're still hard." "They are," Daniel agreed. "But you're harder." They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that came from years of being each other's primary company. Daniel had learned to read his son's moods, to know when to push and when to let things breathe. Tonight was a breathing night. Miles was tired, frustrated with fractions, and needed space more than solutions. "Can I watch TV after homework?" Miles asked. "1 episode, then bed." "2 episodes?" 1.5. Miles grinned. "Deal." It was their ritual, this negotiation. Daniel suspected Miles asked for 2 knowing he'd get 1.5, but he played along because these small moments mattered. These were the things that made a childhood, the tiny traditions that would someday become memories. After dinner, Miles disappeared into the living room, and Daniel cleaned the kitchen with the efficiency of long practice. Dishes washed, counters wiped, tomorrow's coffee prepped in the machine. He'd just finished when he heard the sound, a car door closing across the street, followed by footsteps on wet pavement. He glanced out the window without thinking, a habit born from years of watching the neighborhood. Evelyn Moore was walking toward her house, umbrella in one hand, grocery bag in the other. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone afraid of slipping. They'd been neighbors for 3 years, ever since she'd moved into the Blue Craftsman across the street. Daniel knew almost nothing about her. She was quiet, kept to herself, worked from home doing something with computers. They'd exchanged maybe a dozen conversations in 3 years, all of them brief and polite. "Nice weather. Did you see where they're finally fixing the streetlight? Have a good weekend." She was pretty, in a way that seemed almost accidental. Dark hair usually pulled back, minimal makeup, clothes that prioritized comfort over style. Daniel guessed she was somewhere in her mid-30s, maybe a few years younger than his own 38. She lived alone. No husband, no boyfriend that he'd ever seen, no family visiting on holidays. Just like him, she seemed to be someone who'd learned to be comfortable with solitude. He watched her reach her front door, struggle briefly with the lock while juggling umbrella and groceries, then disappear inside. The lights came on in her living room, and then her kitchen, and then she was gone from view. Daniel turned away from the window and went to check on Miles, who'd already negotiated his way into the second episode by sheer force of selective hearing. He let it slide. "Pick your battles," Sarah used to say. "Pick your battles and win the war." By 8:30, Miles was in bed, and Daniel was back in the garage, this time working on a vacuum cleaner that had sucked up something it shouldn't have. He found the obstruction, a small toy soldier lodged in the intake, and felt an unexpected wave of emotion. Miles used to have soldiers like that. Hundreds of them. They'd staged epic battles across the living room floor, built forts out of couch cushions, created entire worlds that existed only in a child's imagination. Now Miles was into science projects and fractions, and the soldiers sat in a box in the garage, forgotten casualties of growing up. Daniel cleared the blockage, tested the vacuum, and declared it fixed. 1 down, 2 to go. He was considering starting on the toaster oven when he heard it, a knock at his front door. He glanced at the clock. 8:45. Late for visitors, especially on a Tuesday night in a quiet neighborhood where people went to bed early and minded their own business. He walked through the kitchen, wiping his hands again on the increasingly useless rag, and opened the front door. Evelyn Moore stood on his porch, and she'd been crying. Her eyes were red, swollen, her makeup smudged in streaks that the rain had turned into dark rivers down her cheeks. She wasn't wearing a jacket, just a thin sweater that clung to her from the rain, and she was shaking. From cold or emotion, Daniel couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking on the words. "I'm so sorry. I know it's late. Can I come in? Please?" Daniel stepped back without thinking. Of course. Of course, come in." She crossed the threshold like someone stepping into a sanctuary, and he closed the door behind her, shutting out the rain and the darkness and whatever had driven her across the street in the middle of a Tuesday night. "Let me get you a towel," he said, already moving toward the bathroom. "And something hot to drink. Coffee? Tea?" "Tea," she whispered. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble." He returned with a towel and draped it around her shoulders, then went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. His hands moved automatically through the motions: water, kettle, stove, while his mind raced. He'd lived across from Evelyn for 3 years and never seen her like this. Never seen her anything but composed, polite, distant. Whatever had happened, it was big. The kettle whistled. He poured 2 mugs of tea, added honey to both because he didn't know how she took it, and carried them back to the living room. She was sitting on the edge of his couch, the towel still around her shoulders, staring at her hands. "Thank you," she said, when he handed her the mug. "I'm sorry, I'm being ridiculous." "You're not being ridiculous." Daniel sat down in the chair across from her, giving her space. "Whatever it is, you're not being ridiculous." She wrapped both hands around the mug like she was trying to absorb its warmth, and for a long moment she didn't speak. Daniel waited. He'd learned patience from years of coaxing Miles through bad days and broken feelings. You couldn't rush these things. You just had to wait and hold space for whatever needed to come out. Finally, Evelyn looked up at him, and the pain in her eyes was so raw it almost made him look away. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Something I've never told anyone here?" "Yes," Daniel said simply. She took a shaky breath. "I had a daughter once. Her name was Sophie. She was 6 years old and she loved butterflies and drawing and the color purple. She was—" Her voice broke, and she stopped, fighting for control. "She was everything." Daniel felt his chest tighten. The past tense was clear, brutal, final. "I had a husband too, Michael. We were happy, really happy, the kind you don't appreciate until it's gone. And then one day—" She stopped again, and this time the tears came in earnest, spilling down her cheeks. "One day, 7 years ago, they went to the park. Just the 2 of them. Father-daughter time. I stayed home to work on a project, and a drunk driver ran a red light. Evelyn, they died instantly." She continued, the words tumbling out now like she couldn't stop them even if she wanted to. "That's what the police said. They didn't suffer. Like that was supposed to make it better. Like knowing they didn't suffer would somehow fill the hole they left behind." Daniel set his mug down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, giving her his full attention. "I'm so sorry. I moved here to start over," she said. "To escape the memories, the pity, the people who looked at me like I was already dead. I thought if I could just be somewhere new, somewhere nobody knew what happened, I could, I don't know, exist, breathe, something. Has it helped?" She laughed, but it was empty, hollow. "I exist. I breathe. But that's all I do. I work, I eat, I sleep, and every single day feels exactly the same, empty. And tonight I was sitting in my house, and it hit me. This is it. This is my life now. I'm 36 years old, and I'm already dead. I just haven't stopped breathing yet." Daniel understood that feeling more than she knew. The years after Sarah died had been like that, mechanical, automatic. He'd functioned because Miles needed him to function, but inside he'd been hollow. "You're not dead," he said quietly. "You're grieving. For 7 years? However long it takes." Evelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her skin. You lost your wife. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. 5 years ago. Cancer. It was fast, brutal. One day we're planning Miles's 5th birthday party, and 6 months later I'm burying her. I'm sorry. So am I, Daniel said. Every single day I'm sorry. Sorry she didn't get to see Miles grow up. Sorry she didn't get to see the man he's becoming. Sorry she got cheated out of a life that should have been long and full and happy. They sat in silence for a moment, two people who'd lost everything, sharing space in a small living room while the rain continued its steady assault outside. Do you ever think about having more children? Evelyn asked suddenly, and something in her voice made Daniel's pulse quicken. Sometimes, he admitted. Miles asked for a sibling occasionally, but dating as a single dad, it's complicated, and I'm not sure I have the energy to start over. What if you didn't have to date? Evelyn set her mug down and looked at him directly, her eyes still red but suddenly focused with an intensity that made him uneasy. What if someone just asked you to help them have a child? Daniel felt the conversation shift, felt the ground beneath them turn unstable. Evelyn, I'm not asking for a relationship, she said quickly, the words rushing out. I'm not asking for marriage or romance or anything like that. I'm just asking if you would help me have a baby. Be a donor. A father figure if you wanted, but no obligations. I need to be a mother again. I need purpose. I need something to live for that isn't just existing. Daniel stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she was actually asking. This wasn't a hypothetical. This wasn't grief talking. This was a concrete request, delivered with the desperation of someone who'd been drowning for 7 years and just spotted a lifeline. You want me to... He couldn't even finish the sentence. I've thought about this for months. Evelyn continued, leaning forward now, her hands gripping each other. I've looked into sperm donors, adoption, every option available, but they all felt wrong, cold, clinical, and then I watched you with your son, the way you are with him, patient, kind, present, and I thought, why not ask someone who already knows what it means to be a parent? Someone who understands? Evelyn, this is... Daniel stood up, suddenly needing distance. This is a huge thing you're asking. I know. She stood too, but stayed where she was, respecting his need for space. I know it's crazy. I know you probably think I've lost my mind. Maybe I have. But I'm 36 years old, and I can feel time running out, and I cannot spend the rest of my life being this empty. I can't. Daniel ran his hand through his hair, his thoughts a chaotic mess. Part of him wanted to say no immediately, to shut this down before it went any further. But another part, a part he hadn't listened to in years, was actually considering it. I need to think, he said finally. This isn't something I can answer right now. Of course, Evelyn nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come over like this, shouldn't have dumped this on you. Don't apologize, Daniel said. You're hurting, and you asked for help. That takes courage. I need time to process this. How much time? He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the tears and the desperation, but the woman beneath. Someone who'd survived something unsurvivable and was still trying to find reasons to keep going. Someone who'd looked at her empty life and decided to fill it, even if the method was unconventional. Someone, he realized, who reminded him of himself. Give me a few days, he said. Can you do that? Yes. Relief flooded her face. Yes, of course, thank you. Just thank you for not saying no immediately. I didn't say yes either. I know. But you didn't say no, and right now that's enough. She moved toward the door, and Daniel walked her there, opening it to reveal the rain still falling, though lighter now, gentler. She stepped onto the porch, then turned back. I know what I'm asking is huge, she said. I know it's unconventional and strange and probably crosses a dozen lines. But Daniel, I see who you are. I see how you live your life. And I believe, that if you said yes, this wouldn't just save me. It would give a child the kind of father most people only dream about having. Before he could respond, she walked down the steps and across the street, moving quickly through the rain until she disappeared into her house. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time after she'd gone, watching the rain, feeling the cool air against his skin, trying to understand what had just happened. Upstairs, Miles slept peacefully, dreaming whatever 9-year-olds dream about. In the garage, broken appliances waited for Daniel's steady hands to make them whole again. Across the street, Evelyn was probably regretting her entire conversation, wondering if she'd just destroyed the fragile neighborly peace they'd maintained for 3 years. And Daniel stood in the doorway, caught between the life he'd built and the possibility of something else. Something terrifying and complicated and absolutely impossible to ignore. He closed the door, locked it, and stood in his quiet living room for a long moment. Then he did what he always did when life got overwhelming. He went to check on his son. Miles was sprawled across his bed, one arm hanging off the edge, his face peaceful in sleep. Daniel adjusted the blanket over him, smoothed the hair back from his forehead, and felt the familiar ache of love mixed with fear. This boy was everything to him. His reason for getting up every morning, his motivation for every decision, his entire world compressed into 4 feet of energy and curiosity and boundless potential. Could he do this again? Could he willingly bring another child into his life, knowing the responsibility, the weight, the absolute terror of being someone's entire foundation? More importantly, should he? Daniel left Miles's room and went to his own, but he didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain gradually fade to nothing, and thought about Evelyn's request from every possible angle. The practical concerns were obvious. Money, for one. He was barely making ends meet as it was. How would he afford another child? Diapers, formula, clothes, medical bills. The expenses would be enormous. Then there was the question of involvement. Evelyn said she wasn't asking for a relationship, but how did that work with a child? Would he be a father or just a donor? Would the child call him dad? Would there be custody arrangements? What would Miles think about suddenly having a sibling who lived across the street? The questions multiplied like fractals, each one spawning a dozen more, until Daniel's head was spinning with variables and possibilities and potential disasters. But underneath all the practical concerns was something else. Something that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with the raw emotion in Evelyn's eyes when she'd talked about her daughter. The desperate need to matter again, to have purpose, to fill the hole that loss had carved into her life. Daniel understood that need. He lived with it every single day. The rain had stopped completely by the time he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, and his last conscious thought was not about the practical concerns or the logistical nightmares. It was about Evelyn's final words before she left. "You didn't say no." And she was right. Despite everything, despite all the rational reasons to refuse, he hadn't said no. He'd said he needed time to think, which meant, on some level, he was actually considering it. The next morning arrived too quickly, dragging Daniel from dreams he couldn't quite remember into a reality that felt uncomfortably surreal. He went through his morning routine on autopilot, coffee, shower, wake Miles, breakfast, while his mind continued wrestling with Evelyn's request. Miles chattered about school during breakfast, something about a field trip to the science museum, but Daniel only caught every third word. His attention kept drifting to the window, to the blue house across the street, to the question that had kept him awake most of the night. "Dad?" Miles waved a hand in front of his face. "You're not listening." "Sorry, buddy." Daniel refocused on his son. "Science museum, right? Next Friday. We need permission slips signed by Monday. I'll sign it tonight. Are you okay?" Miles tilted his head, studying his father with an intensity that was sometimes unnerving. "You look tired." "Just didn't sleep well," Daniel said, which was the truth, if not the whole truth. "Nothing to worry about." Miles didn't look convinced, but he was 9, not 19, so he let it drop. 20 minutes later, Daniel walked him to the bus stop at the end of the street, same as every morning. Same routine, same schedule, same predictable pattern that had defined their lives for years. Except now, nothing felt the same. He watched the bus pull away, Miles's face visible in one of the windows, already engaged in animated conversation with the kid next to him. Then he turned and started back toward the house, and found himself looking directly at Evelyn's front door. She was probably inside, probably regretting last night, probably hoping he'd just forget the entire conversation and they could go back to being polite strangers who occasionally acknowledged each other's existence. But Daniel couldn't forget. He'd spent the entire night trying, and it hadn't worked. He made a decision. Instead of going home, he crossed the street and knocked on Evelyn's door before he could talk himself out of it. The wait seemed to stretch forever, and he was starting to think she wasn't home when the door finally opened. She looked terrible, eyes still swollen, no makeup, wearing what appeared to be the same clothes from last night. She stared at him with a mixture of hope and dread that made his chest tight. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi." Daniel shoved his hands in his pockets. "Can we talk?" "Of course." She stepped back, letting him in. Her house was the mirror image of his, same layout but different everything else. Where his home was practical and lived in, hers was carefully curated and slightly impersonal, like a display home waiting for actual people to bring it to life. The furniture was nice but generic. The walls held art but nothing personal. No photographs, no mementos, nothing that revealed who actually lived here. It was the house of someone who'd left their life behind and hadn't yet figured out how to build a new one. "I'm sorry about last night," Evelyn said, hovering near the couch but not sitting. "I was emotional and probably said things I shouldn't have." "I haven't made a decision yet," Daniel interrupted, "but I have questions." Her eyes widened slightly. "Okay. Let's sit down." They sat, and Daniel took a breath, organizing his thoughts. "First question. Have you really thought this through? All of it? Because this isn't like adopting a pet or taking a new job. This is a human being who will need you for at least 18 years, probably longer. Are you prepared for that?" "I was a mother for 6 years," Evelyn said quietly. "I know what I'm signing up for." Knowing and being ready are different things. "You're right." She folded her hands in her lap. "But Daniel, I've spent 7 years being not ready for anything. Not ready to move on, not ready to date, not ready to live. If I wait until I'm ready, I'll wait forever. Sometimes you just have to jump." Daniel nodded slowly. "Second question, what exactly are you asking from me? You said no relationship, but how does that work when there's a child involved?" "I've thought about that." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "What I'd like, ideally, is for you to be involved as much as you want to be. If you want to be a father figure, wonderful. If you just want to be a neighbor who contributed genetic material, that's okay too. I'm not trying to trap you or force you into something you don't want. And if I do want to be involved, custody, legal rights, all of that, we'd figure it out together," she said. "I'm not trying to exclude you. I'm just trying not to obligate you to something you don't want." "What about Miles? Have you thought about how this would affect him?" Evelyn paused, and Daniel saw her choose her words carefully. "I think having a sibling could be good for him, but I also think that's something you'd know better than me. You're his father." "Third question," Daniel said. "The practical stuff. Money, healthcare, childcare. How are you planning to handle all that?" "I work from home as a software consultant. I make decent money, enough to support myself and a child comfortably. I'm not asking for financial support from you, though obviously if you wanted to contribute, I wouldn't refuse." "And the mechanics of all this? Are you talking about artificial insemination or—" He stopped, suddenly feeling his face heat. "I've looked into both options," Evelyn said, and he was grateful she kept her tone matter of fact. "Artificial insemination is obviously more clinical, but it's also less reliable and more expensive. The other way is more effective, but obviously more complicated." "Complicated," Daniel repeated. "That's one word for it." They sat in silence for a moment, and Daniel realized he'd run out of questions. Not because he didn't have more, he had hundreds, but because he needed to process the answers he'd already gotten. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said quietly. "Yeah." "Why didn't you say no immediately? Last night you could have shut me down right away. Most people would have. But you didn't. Why?" Daniel looked at her, at this woman who'd lost everything and was still trying to find something to hold on to, and he gave her the truth. "Because I know what it's like to be empty," he said. "I know what it's like to go through the motions and wonder if this is really all there is. And I know that having Miles, being his father, is the only thing that's kept me human all these years. So when you said you needed purpose, needed something to live for, I understood. Maybe that's crazy, but I understood. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. So what do we do now? Now I need more time. Daniel stood up. This isn't a decision I can make quickly. I need to think about Miles, about what this would mean for him. I need to think about myself, about whether I'm capable of doing this. And I need to think about you, about whether this is really what you want or just what you think you want because you're hurting. That's fair? She stood too. How much time do you need? I don't know, a week? Maybe more? Take whatever time you need. Evelyn walked him to the door. And Daniel, thank you for not thinking I'm crazy, for even considering this. That means more than you know. Daniel stepped out onto her porch, then turned back. One more question. Okay. If I said yes, and I'm not saying I will, but if I did, would you be open to taking things slow? Getting to know each other better first? Because jumping into something this big with someone I barely know seems like a recipe for disaster. A small smile touched Evelyn's face, the first he'd seen from her. I'd be open to that. More than open. Okay? Daniel nodded. I'll be in touch. He crossed the street back to his own house, his mind somehow more cluttered than before. He'd gone over there hoping to find clarity, and instead he'd found himself deeper in the maze of possibility. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He worked on the vacuum cleaner, called Mrs. Patterson about her washing machine, fielded calls from 3 potential new clients. Normal things, routine things, but nothing felt normal anymore. When Miles got home from school, Daniel found himself studying his son with new eyes, trying to imagine what it would be like for him to have a sibling, trying to imagine how to explain that the lady across the street was having his father's baby. But it wasn't like that. It was complicated. How did you explain complicated to a 9-year-old? Dad, you're doing it again, Miles said, looking up from his homework. Doing what? Staring into space. You've been weird all day. Daniel sighed and sat down across from him. I've got something on my mind, that's all. What? Adult stuff. Nothing for you to worry about. Miles frowned. Is it money stuff? Because Jamie's dad lost his job and Jamie said they might have to move, and I don't want us to have to move. It's not money stuff, Daniel assured him. We're okay. I promise. Then what? Daniel looked at his son and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders again. Every decision he made affected Miles. Every choice rippled through his son's life. He couldn't forget that, couldn't put it aside, not even for something as compelling as Evelyn's request. Just some decisions I need to make about the future set, he said finally. But I promise, whatever I decide, you're going to be part of that conversation, okay? Miles nodded slowly, accepting this the way he accepted most things from his father, with trust that sometimes broke Daniel's heart. Okay. That night, after Miles was asleep, Daniel stood at his bedroom window and looked across the street at Evelyn's house. The lights were on in her living room, and he could see her silhouette moving past the window. She was alone in there, just like he was alone in here. 2 people who'd been broken by loss trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. The question wasn't whether he wanted to help her. He did. The question was whether helping her was the right thing to do, for Miles, for himself, for the potential child who would be born into this complicated situation. Daniel watched until Evelyn's lights went out. Then he climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally claimed him. He dreamed of Sarah that night, which was unusual. Mostly she existed in his waking thoughts, in the 1,000 small ways he still missed her. But tonight she was vivid, real, standing in their old kitchen before the cancer, before everything fell apart. In the dream, she was baking cookies while Miles, young Miles, 4-year-old Miles, drew pictures at the table. She looked up at Daniel and smiled, flower on her cheek, happiness in her eyes. You're going to say yes, she said, and it wasn't a question. I don't know, Dream Daniel replied. It's complicated. Life is complicated, Sarah said. That's not a reason to say no. What if I screw it up? What if I can't handle 2 kids? She laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen with warmth. Daniel, you're already handling it. You've been handling it since the day I died. You don't give yourself enough credit. I miss you, he said, and the words carried 5 years of grief. I miss you too. Sarah came around the counter and took his hands. But I'm gone. And you're still here. And you deserve to build a life that isn't just about surviving. You deserve to actually live again. Even if it's unconventional. Especially if it's unconventional. She squeezed his hands. We were never conventional, remember? We eloped to Vegas, we bought a house we couldn't afford, we had Miles 3 years before we planned to. When did conventional ever stop you? When I became responsible for a child alone. You're not alone, Sarah said gently. You're choosing not to be alone. There's a difference. Daniel woke up with the dream still fresh in his mind, Sarah's words echoing in his thoughts. The clock read 4:30 in the morning, too early to get up, but too late to fall back asleep. He lay there in the darkness, and for the first time since Evelyn knocked on his door, he let himself actually consider what saying yes would mean. Not the problems, not the obstacles, not the 1,000 reasons it could go wrong, just what it would mean. It would mean a child, another life, another person who would call him dad, another responsibility added to the ones he already carried. It would mean connection. To Evelyn, to something beyond his small, carefully controlled world. It would mean risk. The risk of failure, of disappointment, of loss. But it would also mean possibility. The possibility that life could be more than just getting through each day. The possibility that he could matter to someone new. The possibility that empty houses could become full again. Daniel got up and made coffee, then stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up over the neighborhood. Across the street, Evelyn's house was still dark. She was probably sleeping, or trying to, or lying awake wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake by asking. He thought about what he'd tell Miles, how he'd explain that yes, Daddy is helping the lady across the street have a baby, and yes, that will sort of make you a big brother. And no, it's not like most families, but most families aren't like us anyway, so we might as well be weird in our own way. He thought about what he'd tell his parents, who lived in Florida and called once a week to check on their grandson and their widowed son. They'd probably think he'd lost his mind. They might be right. He thought about what he'd tell himself when doubt crept in at 3 in the morning and whispered that he was making a massive mistake. But mostly, he thought about Evelyn's face when she talked about her daughter. The raw grief, the desperate hope, the absolute conviction that she needed to be a mother again or she'd never be whole. And he thought about Sarah's dream words. You deserve to actually live again. By the time Miles woke up, Daniel had made his decision. He wasn't sure it was the right one. He wasn't sure it was smart or safe or sensible, but he was sure that Evelyn had asked for help, and he had the power to give it. And turning away from someone drowning just because the rescue might be complicated felt like exactly the wrong choice. He'd talk to her tonight. After Miles was asleep, he'd walk across the street and tell her yes, with conditions, with boundaries. With 100 conversations ahead of them about how this would actually work. But yes, the answer, impossibly, unexpectedly, was yes. That evening, after the dinner dishes were cleaned and Miles was absorbed in building something elaborate with his Lego set, Daniel stood at his living room window and watched the lights come on across the street. His heart hammered against his ribs in a way it hadn't since the night he'd proposed to Sarah 15 years ago. Different circumstances, same terror. He'd spent the entire day second-guessing himself, cycling through certainty and doubt like a man trapped on an emotional carousel. Every time he convinced himself this was right, his brain would conjure another disaster scenario. What if the child resented being born into such an unusual arrangement? What if Evelyn changed her mind halfway through the pregnancy? What if Miles felt replaced or abandoned? What if Daniel simply wasn't capable of loving another child the way he loved his son? The questions had no answers, only more questions, and at some point Daniel had realized he could spend the rest of his life asking them, or he could just take the leap and trust himself to figure it out. Dad? Miles appeared at his elbow, clutching a partially assembled spaceship. Can you help me with this part? The instructions don't make sense. Daniel pulled himself away from the window and sat down on the floor with his son, examining the incomprehensible diagram that allegedly explained how 12 tiny pieces fit together. They worked in comfortable silence, Daniel's hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind continued its anxious spiral. There! He snapped the final piece into place. What do you think? Miles held up the spaceship, turning it to catch the light. Perfect. Thanks, Dad. Anytime, buddy. Miles settled back into his construction project, and Daniel returned to the window. Across the street, he could see Evelyn moving through her kitchen, probably making dinner for one. The loneliness of that image struck him harder than it should have. How many nights had he done the same thing? How many meals had he eaten in silence after Miles went to bed? The house too quiet, the future too empty. "I need to go talk to Miss Moore for a few minutes," Daniel said, making the decision before he could retreat from it. "Will you be okay here by yourself?" Miles looked up, surprised. Miss Moore was what they called Evelyn on the rare occasions her name came up, which was almost never. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong, just some adult stuff we need to discuss." "Okay." Miles returned to his Legos, already losing interest. At 9, adult conversations ranked somewhere below broccoli on the scale of interesting things. Daniel grabbed his jacket and crossed the street before his courage could fail him. The walk felt longer than it should have. Each step weighted with the enormity of what he was about to say. He climbed Evelyn's porch steps, raised his hand to knock, then paused. This was it. The moment where everything changed. Once he said the words, there was no taking them back. No pretending this conversation never happened. He'd be committing to something that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives, including that of a child who didn't even exist yet. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and Evelyn stood there in jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face free of makeup. She looked young and vulnerable and terrified, and Daniel realized she'd been watching for him just as intently as he'd been watching her house. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I come in?" "Of course." She stepped back and he entered the house that was starting to feel oddly familiar despite having been inside it exactly once before. They moved to the living room, and this time they both sat without the awkward hovering. Evelyn perched on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Daniel took the same chair he'd occupied 2 nights ago. "I've been thinking." He started, then stopped, trying to organize thoughts that refused to be organized. "Actually, that's an understatement. I haven't stopped thinking since you knocked on my door." "I know," Evelyn said. "I haven't slept. I keep replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I should have said it differently, or not said it at all, or—" "I want to say yes," Daniel interrupted and watched her entire body go still. "But I need us to be very clear about what that means, because I can't do this without some ground rules." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, nodding rapidly. "Okay, yes, whatever you need." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, choosing his words carefully. "First, I need time before we actually try for a baby. I need us to get to know each other, to build some kind of foundation that isn't based on desperation and grief. I need to know who you are beyond the woman who lost her family, and you need to know me beyond the single dad fixing appliances across the street." "How much time?" Evelyn asked. "I don't know. A few months at least, maybe longer. However long it takes for this to feel less like a transaction and more like a choice we're both making with clear heads." "That's fair." She nodded. "What else?" "I want to be involved," Daniel said firmly. "Not just as a donor, but as a parent. If we do this, that child will be mine too, and I need legal rights, custody arrangements, all of it properly documented. I'm not comfortable creating a life and then being a stranger to it." "I don't want you to be a stranger," Evelyn said quickly. "I meant what I said before. I'd welcome your involvement. I just didn't want to assume or pressure you." "Well, I'm telling you now. If I do this, I'm all in, which means we need lawyers, we need agreements, we need everything spelled out so nobody gets hurt down the line." "Okay." Evelyn's hands were shaking slightly. "I can work with that." "Third." Daniel held up 3 fingers. "Miles comes first, always. I need you to understand that whatever happens between us, whatever arrangement we make, my son's well-being is non-negotiable. If this starts to hurt him in any way, we stop." "Of course," Evelyn said. "I would never want to hurt Miles." "I know you wouldn't intentionally," Daniel said gently. "But this is going to affect him whether we want it to or not. He's going to have questions, feelings, probably some jealousy and confusion. We need to be prepared to handle that." "When will you tell him?" "Not yet," Daniel said. First, we see if this is actually viable. We spend time together, figure out if we can stand each other for more than 20 minutes at a time. If that works, then we have the conversation with Miles, but I'm not putting him through emotional turmoil for something that might not even happen. Evelyn absorbed this, then asked quietly, "What if he says no? What if you tell him and he hates the idea?" Daniel had thought about this extensively. Then we have a problem, because I'm not doing this over my son's strong objection. But I also think, I hope, that if we present it right, he might actually be okay with it. He's been asking for a sibling for years. Has he? Every Christmas, every birthday wish, every time one of his friends' parents has a baby. "Dad, when am I going to get a brother or sister?" It breaks my heart every time because I never had an answer that felt honest. Evelyn wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "How could you? We barely know each other." Daniel paused, then continued. "Which brings me to my last condition. We do this right. We go on dates, we have actual conversations, we build something that looks like friendship at minimum. Because even if we're not in a romantic relationship, we're still going to be connected for the rest of our lives through this child. I need to know I can trust you, respect you, communicate with you when things get hard." "I want that too," Evelyn said, and there was something in her voice, relief maybe, or hope. "I don't want this to be some cold arrangement. I need for it to mean something." They sat in silence for a moment, and Daniel felt the weight of the decision settle over both of them. This was real now. They were actually doing this. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but the trajectory had been set. "So we're really doing this?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We're trying," Daniel corrected. "We're going to spend the next few months getting to know each other. And if it works, if we can build something solid enough to bring a child into, then yes, we're doing this." Evelyn stood up suddenly and crossed the room to where Daniel sat. For a moment he thought she might hug him, but she just extended her hand. "Thank you. Thank you for taking a chance on this. On me." Daniel stood and took her hand, shaking it formally, despite the intimacy of the conversation they'd just had. "Thank you for trusting me with something this important." They stood there, hands clasped, and Daniel wondered what Sarah would think of this moment. Probably she'd laugh at the formality of it, at two people shaking hands over an agreement to create a life together. But she'd also understand, he thought. She'd understand that sometimes the unconventional paths were the only ones that led anywhere worth going. "So what happens now?" Evelyn asked, releasing his hand. "Now we start simple. Dinner tomorrow night? Just the two of us. Somewhere we can talk." "I'd like that." A small smile touched her lips. "Should I dress up, or is this casual?" "Evelyn, we're going to discuss the mechanics of creating a human being together. I think we're past worrying about dress codes." She laughed, and the sound surprised both of them. "Fair point." Daniel moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. If at any point this doesn't feel right to you, if you change your mind or realize this isn't what you actually want, you tell me immediately. No guilt, no apologies, just honesty. Can you promise me that?" "I promise," Evelyn said. "Same goes for you." "Deal." He crossed back to his house, his mind racing with everything they'd just agreed to. The conditions, the timeline, the 1,000 details they'd need to sort out before any of this could actually happen. It should have felt overwhelming, but instead, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Miles was exactly where Daniel had left him, surrounded by an expanding universe of plastic spaceship parts. He looked up as his father came in, studying him with that too perceptive gaze. "Everything okay with Miss Moore?" he asked. "Yeah, buddy, everything's fine." "You look happy." Daniel paused, considering this. "You know what? I think I am." The next evening, Daniel found himself sitting across from Evelyn at a small Italian restaurant 20 minutes outside their neighborhood. He'd chosen a place where they were unlikely to run into anyone they knew, not because he was ashamed, but because he wasn't ready to explain this to the handful of acquaintances who made up his social circle. Evelyn had dressed up despite his comment about dress codes, wearing a simple black dress that made her look elegant and nervous in equal measure. Daniel had stuck with khakis and a button-down, the closest thing to formal wear he owned that didn't involve a funeral. "I haven't been on a date in 7 years." Evelyn said after they'd ordered, her fingers fidgeting with the napkin in her lap. I'm not sure I remember how this works. If it helps, I haven't been on one in about the same amount of time, Daniel said. And technically, I'm not sure this counts as a date. It's more like a business meeting about making a baby. That's possibly the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I have a gift. She laughed again, more easily this time, and Daniel felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. This might actually work. They might actually be able to do this without it being completely awkward. Tell me about your work, he said. Software consulting, right? Right. I design database systems for mid-sized companies, help them optimize their data infrastructure, occasionally fix catastrophic problems when they ignore my initial recommendations, and everything breaks. Do you like it? Evelyn considered this. I'm good at it. It pays well. It lets me work from home, which I needed after everything. But like it? I don't know. It's just what I do. I know that feeling, Daniel said. Fixing appliances wasn't my dream career. It just sort of happened after Sarah got sick, and I needed flexible work that let me be home for miles. What did you do before? I was an electrician. Good money, steady work, but the hours were brutal. When Sarah got her diagnosis, I couldn't keep leaving Miles with babysitters while I worked 10-hour days. So I quit, took my severance, and started the repair business. Turns out people always need their stuff fixed, and they don't care if you show up in a uniform or your own truck. The food arrived and they ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Evelyn spoke again. Can I ask about Sarah? About how you met? What she was like? Daniel smiled at the memory. We met at a hardware store, actually. I was there buying electrical supplies. She was trying to figure out what kind of paint to use for her apartment. I helped her pick colors. We got to talking. I asked her out. 6 months later, we were married. That's fast. It was perfect, Daniel said. She was perfect. Spontaneous, funny, completely fearless about life. She made me braver just by existing. When she got sick, he stopped, the familiar tightness returning to his chest. When she got sick, she faced it the same way she faced everything else. Head on, no complaints, just pure determination to fight as long as she could. I'm sorry you lost her. I'm sorry you lost your family, Daniel said. Tell me about them. About Michael and Sophie. Evelyn's eyes misted, but she didn't look away. Michael was a teacher. High school history. He loved it, loved those kids, even the terrible ones. Sophie was... Her voice cracked. She was pure joy. Always laughing, always asking questions, always wanting to know why things worked the way they did. She would have been 13 now, probably giving us grief about boys and makeup and staying out late. You talk about them in a way that keeps them alive, Daniel observed. That's important. My grief counselor said I should try to let them go, move forward, Evelyn said bitterly. But I don't want to let them go. They were my life. Moving forward doesn't mean pretending they never existed. No, Daniel agreed. It doesn't. Moving forward means taking them with you, just in a different way. They talked through dinner, through dessert, through 2 cups of coffee each. The conversation flowed easier than Daniel had expected, touching on everything from their childhoods to their favorite movies to their most embarrassing moments. By the time they left the restaurant, he felt like he'd learned more about Evelyn in 2 hours than he'd learned about anyone in years. In the parking lot, standing beside their cars, Evelyn turned to him with a serious expression. I need to tell you something, she said. Something I probably should have mentioned before, but I was afraid it would make you change your mind. Daniel's stomach tightened. Okay. I've tried to have a baby before, after Michael and Sophie died. I tried for 2 years with a sperm donor through a clinic. It never worked. My doctor said there's nothing medically wrong with me, that sometimes it just takes time, but... She wrapped her arms around herself. What if I can't? What if we go through all of this and it doesn't happen? Daniel thought about this, about the possibility of failure built into an already complicated situation. Then we deal with it if it happens. But Evelyn, you know there are no guarantees in any of this, right? Even if you get pregnant, there are 1,000 things that could go wrong. We can't plan for every variable. I know, I just needed you to know it might not be easy. Nothing about this is easy, Daniel said. But we're trying anyway, so I guess we're both a little crazy. She smiled. Maybe that's what makes us compatible. Over the following weeks, they fell into a pattern. Dinner once a week, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes at one of their houses with Miles as an enthusiastic third wheel who seemed delighted that his dad had a friend. They talked about everything, their pasts, their fears, their hopes for the future. Slowly, the awkwardness faded, replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine friendship. Daniel learned that Evelyn loved old mystery novels, terrible reality TV, and hiking in the early morning when the world was still quiet. She learned that he couldn't carry a tune to save his life, had a secret weakness for romantic comedies, and made the world's worst coffee but refused to admit it. They established boundaries and broke through them carefully. The first time Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed Daniel's hand during a difficult conversation about Sarah's final days, he felt a shock of connection that surprised him. The first time he made her laugh so hard she snorted. Embarrassed and delighted in equal measure, something shifted in his chest. This wasn't falling in love. Not yet, maybe not ever in the traditional sense. But it was something, some kind of bond forming between two people who'd started as strangers and were becoming something else entirely. 2 months into their arrangement, Daniel finally sat Miles down for the conversation he'd been dreading. They were in the living room, Miles sprawled on the couch with a book, Daniel pacing nervously. He'd rehearsed this a dozen times in his head, but now that the moment had arrived, every planned word felt inadequate. "Buddy, I need to talk to you about something important." He started. Miles looked up, instantly wary. In his experience, important talks usually meant bad news. "Am I in trouble?" "No, nothing like that, but I need you to listen carefully and ask questions if you don't understand something, okay?" "Okay." Miles set his book aside, giving his father his full attention. Daniel sat down in the chair across from him, leaning forward. "You know how you've been asking for a brother or sister?" Miles's eyes widened. "Are you dating someone? Is it Miss Moore? Jeremy said he saw you guys at that restaurant, and I told him you were just friends, but slow down." Daniel held up a hand. "Yes, I've been spending time with Evelyn, Miss Moore, and we are friends. Really good friends, actually. But it's a little more complicated than that." "Complicated how?" There was no easy way to say this, so Daniel just said it. "Evelyn lost her husband and daughter in an accident a long time ago. She wants to be a mom again, and she asked if I would help her have a baby." Miles stared at him, processing. "Like, help her find a baby to adopt?" "No, help her have a baby, be the baby's father." The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Miles's face cycled through confusion, surprise, and something Daniel couldn't quite identify before settling on cautious curiosity. "But you're not married to her," Miles said finally. "No, we're not, and we're not planning to get married, but we would both be the baby's parents." "So I'd have a brother or sister who lives across the street?" "Sort of. We'd work out the details, but yes, something like that." Miles thought about this, his young mind working through the logistics. "Would the baby have 2 houses?" "Probably." "Would I see them a lot?" "As much as you wanted to." More silence, then, "Does Miss Moore know about Mom?" The question hit Daniel in the chest. "Yes, buddy. She knows all about your mom. She knows how special she was, and she's not trying to replace her or be your new mom or anything like that." "Good," Miles said firmly, "because nobody can replace Mom." "No," Daniel agreed. "Nobody can." Miles picked at the edge of his book, thinking. Jeremy has a baby sister, and she cries all the time and smells bad. Is that what this baby would be like? Despite everything, Daniel smiled. Probably, at least at first. But then they get older and more fun. Yeah, they do. And I'd be a big brother? Like the baby would look up to me and stuff? Absolutely. Miles nodded slowly, and Daniel could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Can I think about it? Of course. Take all the time you need. Okay. Miles picked up his book again, then paused. Dad? Are you happy? Like, does spending time with Miss Moore make you happy? The question was so earnest, so purely concerned with his father's well-being, that Daniel felt his throat tighten. Yeah, buddy, it does. Then I think it's okay, Miles said simply. I mean, I'll have to think about the baby part more, but if you're happy, that's good. Daniel crossed to the couch and pulled his son into a hug, overwhelmed with love for this kid who'd been through so much loss and still had room in his heart to care about his father's happiness. "I love you," he said into Miles's hair. "Love you too, Dad," Miles said, then squirmed away. "But you're crushing me." That night, Daniel called Evelyn and told her about the conversation. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He's an amazing kid," she said finally. "You've done an incredible job with him." "He's resilient," Daniel said, "but I want to give him more time before we move forward. Make sure he's really okay with this." "Of course. Whatever he needs." Over the next month, something unexpected happened. Miles started spending time with Evelyn. It began casually. He'd see her in her yard and wander over to ask about the flowers she was planting. She'd invite him in for cookies, and they'd end up talking for an hour. Soon it became routine. After school, Miles would often choose to do his homework at Evelyn's kitchen table while she worked on her laptop nearby. Daniel watched this unfold with a mixture of relief and emotion he couldn't quite name. Evelyn was careful never to overstep, never to try to be anything other than a friend and neighbor, but she was also genuinely interested in Miles, in his thoughts and ideas and endless questions. She helped him with his science projects, listened to his stories about school, treated him with the same respect she'd treat an adult. And Miles, who'd been without a mother figure for 5 years, bloomed under her attention. "She's pretty cool," Miles announced one evening at dinner. "She knows about planets and stuff, and she doesn't get mad when I ask too many questions." "That is pretty cool," Daniel agreed. "I think," Miles paused, choosing his words carefully, "I think I'd be okay with her having a baby. Our baby. I mean, if you guys still want to." Daniel set down his fork. "Yeah? Yeah. She'd be a good mom. And I think I'd be a good big brother." "I think you'd be an amazing big brother." Miles grinned, then went back to his spaghetti, and Daniel marveled at the resilience of children, at their capacity to accept the unusual and make it normal through sheer force of will. That weekend, Daniel invited Evelyn over for what he mentally termed the real conversation. Miles was at a friend's house for a sleepover, giving them privacy to discuss the details they'd been avoiding. They sat at his kitchen table with coffee, neither of them was drinking, and Daniel pulled out a legal pad where he'd written down everything they needed to address. "Okay," he said, "if we're really doing this, we need to talk about the uncomfortable stuff." "I'm ready," Evelyn said, though her hands were shaking slightly. "First, the actual conception. We need to decide if we're doing this clinically or—" He gestured vaguely. "Naturally," Evelyn finished. "I've been thinking about that. The clinical route is expensive and less effective. And if we're being honest, we're already planning something unconventional. Does it really matter how we get there?" Daniel had thought about this extensively, had wrestled with the implications and the intimacy it would require. If we go that route, we need to be very clear that it's not about a relationship. "It's a means to an end." "Agreed," Evelyn said, "though I hope, we've become close enough that it won't be completely awkward." "Just moderately awkward." "Exactly." They smiled at each other, and Daniel felt some of the tension ease. They could do this. They'd built enough trust, enough friendship, to navigate even the uncomfortable parts. "Second issue," Daniel continued. "Legal custody. I want equal rights, equal say in decisions, equal time if possible." "I want that too," Evelyn said. "I've already talked to a lawyer about drawing up a co-parenting agreement. We can specify everything: custody schedule, medical decisions, education, all of it." "Good." Third, finances. How do we split costs? They talked through budgets and expenses, through childcare and healthcare and college funds. Evelyn insisted on covering medical costs since she made more money. Daniel insisted on contributing equally to everything else. They compromised, negotiated, found middle ground. "Also, what about telling people?" Evelyn asked. "Friends, family, neighbors? What's our story?" "The truth," Daniel said. "Maybe not all the details, but the truth. We're friends who decided to have a child together. People can make of it what they will." "Your parents?" Daniel winced. "That'll be a fun phone call, but they'll come around. They just want Miles and me to be happy." "Mine won't care," Evelyn said quietly. "They stopped checking in years ago. Too painful for them, seeing me stuck in grief. Easier to just disconnect. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. Then we'll be each other's family. You, me, Miles, and whoever this baby turns out to be. Evelyn squeezed his hand, and Daniel saw tears in her eyes. How did we get here? Two people who barely knew each other 4 months ago, planning a life together. Desperation, insanity, and maybe a little bit of faith, Daniel said. The usual. She laughed through her tears, and they sat there holding hands across the kitchen table, two broken people who'd somehow found a way to build something new from the pieces. So when, Evelyn asked, when do we actually try? Daniel thought about Miles, about Evelyn, about the life they were planning to create. Let's give it until after the holidays. That gives us a few more months to make sure this is right, to get all the legal stuff in order, to prepare Miles more thoroughly. 3 months, Evelyn said, and something flickered in her eyes, fear mixed with hope. I can wait 3 months. They spent the rest of the evening talking through scenarios, contingencies, all the what-ifs they could imagine. What if Evelyn got pregnant immediately? What if it took years? What if there were complications? What if the child had special needs? What if one of them met someone else and wanted a traditional relationship? By the time Evelyn left, Daniel's head was spinning with possibilities, and his heart was racing with the enormity of what they'd agreed to. He stood at his window and watched her cross the street, watched her enter her house and turn on the lights, and wondered if they were brave or just foolish. Probably both. The next 3 months passed in a blur of preparation and growing anticipation. The lawyers drew up agreements that spelled out custody, finances, decision-making authority. Miles became increasingly comfortable with Evelyn, even starting to call her by her first name instead of Miss Moore. Daniel's parents called and reacted about as well as he'd expected. Confusion, concern, eventual acceptance born from knowing their son well enough to trust his judgment. And through it all, Daniel and Evelyn grew closer. Not romantically exactly, but with a depth of connection he hadn't experienced since Sarah. They knew each other's fears now, their wounds, their hopes for the future. They'd built something solid enough to support the weight of what they were about to attempt. On a cold January evening, with snow falling softly outside and Miles asleep upstairs, Evelyn knocked on Daniel's door. She'd been tracking her cycle carefully, and the time had come. Daniel opened the door and saw everything he needed to know in her eyes. Nervousness, determination, trust. Hi, she said softly. Hi. He stepped back. You're sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything, Evelyn said, and Daniel believed her. They climbed the stairs together, hands linked, hearts pounding, about to cross a line that would forever change everything. This was it. The moment where hope became action, where plans became reality, where two broken people took the first real step toward becoming whole again. The bedroom door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. Daniel had cleaned earlier, changed the sheets, lit a single candle on the dresser that now felt absurdly romantic given the clinical nature of what they were attempting. Evelyn stood near the window, her coat still on, her breath visible in small clouds despite the heating running full blast. I'm nervous, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Me too, Daniel said, and the honesty felt like the only solid ground in a moment that threatened to sweep them both away. We can stop any time. You know that, right? I know. She turned to face him, and in the dim light he could see the fear and determination warring in her expression. But I don't want to stop. I want this. I want... Her voice cracked. I need this to work. Daniel crossed to her slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to flee, to do anything except stay. But she didn't move, just watched him approach with eyes that held 7 years of grief and hope in equal measure. Then we try, he said simply, and reached for her hand. What followed was tender and awkward, and nothing like either of them had imagined. They moved together with the hesitation of people who cared deeply about not hurting each other, who understood that this moment carried the weight of all their broken pieces and desperate hopes. There was no passion, no romance, just two people trying to create something beautiful from their shared wreckage. Afterward, they lay beside each other in the darkness, not touching, but not apart either. and Daniel stared at the ceiling, wondering what the hell they'd just done. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly. "I know that was awkward, doesn't even begin to cover it." "We'll get better at it," Daniel said, then immediately regretted the implication that there would be a next time and another, and however many it took. "Will we?" She turned her head to look at him. "Or will it always feel like we're betraying people who aren't here anymore?" The question hit Daniel hard because he'd felt it too. That ghost of guilt that Sarah was watching somehow, judging. But he pushed it away because Sarah had told him in that dream to live again, and he chose to believe that meant this too. "I think they'd understand," he said. "Sarah, Michael, they'd understand that we're not trying to replace them. We're just trying to survive them." Evelyn's hand found his in the darkness, squeezed once, then let go. "I should go home. Miles might wake up and wonder where you are." "Stay a few more minutes," Daniel said. "Just until we know it. Until we know we gave it the best chance." So they stayed, lying side by side in a bed that had once belonged to Daniel and Sarah, now serving as the unlikely location for a different kind of beginning. Eventually, Evelyn rose, dressed quietly, and slipped out into the winter night. Daniel watched from the window as she crossed the street, a solitary figure in the falling snow, and wondered if they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives, or the bravest decision. The next morning, Miles came downstairs and found his father making pancakes, which was unusual. Daniel only made pancakes on special occasions. "What's going on, Mom?" Miles asked suspiciously. "Did something happen?" "Can't a guy make pancakes for his kid without an interrogation?" Daniel replied, flipping one expertly. "Not you. You only make pancakes when something's up." Daniel smiled despite himself. 9 years old and already reading him like a book. "Evelyn and I are trying for a baby now. We started last night." Miles absorbed this information while pouring himself orange juice. "Does it work right away?" "Sometimes. More often, it takes a while." "How long?" "Could be months, could be longer." Daniel set a plate of pancakes in front of his son. "We just have to be patient." "Okay." Miles drowned his pancakes in syrup, then looked up. "Dad, are you scared?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "Yeah, buddy, I'm terrified." "Why?" "Because what if I'm not a good enough dad for 2 kids? What if I mess up? What if something goes wrong?" Miles considered this seriously. "You're already a good dad for me, so probably you'll be good for another kid too." The simple logic of childhood, delivered with absolute conviction. Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Thanks, buddy." "You're welcome. Can I have more pancakes?" The weeks that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Daniel and Evelyn continued their attempts with the clinical efficiency of people trying very hard not to think too deeply about what they were doing. Every few days, depending on where Evelyn was in her cycle, she'd come over after Miles was asleep, and they'd go upstairs and try again to create a life. It should have become easier with repetition, but it didn't. Each time carried the same weight of hope and awkwardness, the same feeling that they were reaching for something just beyond their grasp. "I started my period today," Evelyn said one evening in late February, standing in Daniel's kitchen with tears streaming down her face. "That's 2 months of trying and nothing." Daniel pulled her into a hug, feeling her shake against him. "It's only been 2 months. The doctor said it could take 6 months to a year for a healthy couple." "But what if there's something wrong with me?" She sobbed into his shoulder. "What if I can't have children anymore? What if my body just gave up after losing Sophie?" "Hey," Daniel pulled back enough to look at her face. "We don't know that. We can't assume the worst after only 2 months. But the clinic, when I tried before, it never worked." "This isn't the clinic," Daniel said firmly. "This is different. We're different. We have to give it time." Evelyn nodded, but didn't look convinced. She pulled away, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry, I'm being ridiculous." "You're being human," Daniel corrected. "You're being someone who wants something badly and is afraid of being disappointed. That's not ridiculous." She managed a weak smile. "How are you so calm about this?" "I'm not calm," Daniel admitted. "I'm just better at hiding it. Inside, I'm panicking too." "About what?" He gestured vaguely. "Everything. What if it does work and I can't handle 2 kids? What if Miles resents his sibling? What if we're making a huge mistake and ruining multiple lives in the process? Those are good panics, Evelyn said, and despite everything, she laughed. Very thorough. I'm an overthinker. Me too. She took a shaky breath. Okay, we keep trying. We give it 6 months, like the doctor said, and if nothing happens, then we reassess. Deal. But March came and went with the same result. Then April. Each month brought the same cycle of hope building and hope crashing, of Evelyn showing up at Daniel's door with tears in her eyes to report another failure, of Daniel holding her while she cried and pretending his own disappointment wasn't crushing his chest. Miles noticed the pattern, noticed how his father's mood would drop every few weeks, noticed how Evelyn would disappear for a few days and come back looking hollow. It's not working, is it? He asked one evening in late April. The baby thing. Daniel looked up from the dishwasher he was loading. What makes you say that? You get sad every few weeks, and Evelyn gets sad too, so I figured it means it's not working. There was no point in lying. It hasn't worked yet, but that doesn't mean it won't. What if it never does? Miles asked, with the bluntness of children who haven't learned to soften hard questions. Then we deal with that if it happens, Daniel said. But we're not giving up yet. Miles nodded, then went back to his homework, and Daniel marveled again at his son's resilience, at how he'd accepted this entire situation without the drama or resistance Daniel had feared. May brought another disappointment, and Daniel found Evelyn sitting on her porch steps in the rain, makeup running down her face, looking more defeated than he'd ever seen her. I can't do this anymore, she said when he sat down beside her. I can't keep hoping and failing. It's killing me. Evelyn, no, listen. She turned to him, rain plastering her hair to her face. When Michael and Sophie died, I thought that was the worst pain I'd ever feel. But this hoping for something every month and having it ripped away. It's like losing them all over again, every single time. Daniel felt his heart break for her, for them both. What do you want to do? I don't know. She wrapped her arms around herself. Part of me wants to quit, to stop putting myself through this torture. But part of me can't let go of the possibility that next month might be different. So we keep trying, Daniel said. 1 more month. And if it doesn't work, we talk about other options. What other options? I don't know. Maybe we see a fertility specialist. Maybe we look into adoption. Maybe we just accept that this particular path isn't working and find a different one. Evelyn leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in the rain together, 2 people who'd been through too much already and were stubbornly refusing to accept one more loss. Okay, she whispered, 1 more month. June arrived with unseasonable heat and the kind of humidity that made everything feel heavy and slow. Daniel had given up hoping, had armored himself against disappointment so thoroughly that when Evelyn appeared at his door on a Tuesday evening, he almost didn't want to let her in. I'm late, she said before he could speak. Daniel's heart stuttered. Late how? 5 days, I'm never late. Never. Her hands were shaking. I took 3 tests this morning, all positive. The world tilted sideways. Daniel grabbed the doorframe to steady himself. You're pregnant? I'm pregnant, Evelyn repeated, and then she was crying and laughing simultaneously, a mess of emotion that spilled out all at once. I can't believe it. After 5 months of nothing, I was so sure it would never happen, and then Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her while she shook with the force of her relief and terror. He felt his own tears burning behind his eyes, but blinked them back, needing to be strong for her even as his mind raced with the implications. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. There was a life growing inside her, a child that would be both of theirs, a future that had seemed impossible just moments ago. We need to see a doctor, Daniel said, his voice rough. Make sure everything's okay. Get proper confirmation. I already called. Evelyn pulled back, wiping her eyes. I have an appointment tomorrow at 2. Will you come with me? Of course, Daniel said without hesitation. We're in this together. The next day, Daniel left Miles with a neighbor and met Evelyn at the doctor's office. They sat in the waiting room surrounded by pregnant women in various stages, couples holding hands, and he felt the surreality of his situation wash over him again. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. He was supposed to be here with a wife, not a friend he was having a baby with in the most unconventional arrangement possible. But when they called Evelyn's name and she reached for his hand, he pushed the doubts away and followed her into the examination room. The ultrasound technician was a cheerful woman in her 50s who made small talk while setting up the equipment. "So, how long have you two been trying?" "5 months," Evelyn said, and Daniel heard the weight of those months in her voice. "Well, congratulations." The technician smiled. "Let's take a look at your little one." The screen flickered to life, showing grainy images that meant nothing to Daniel until the technician pointed. "There, see that flicker? That's the heartbeat." And suddenly Daniel could see it, a tiny, rapid flutter on the screen that represented a life. Their life. A child who would call him Dad, who would be Miles's sibling, who would forever connect him to Evelyn in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Everything looks good," the technician continued. "Based on measurements, I'd say you're about 6 weeks along. Due date would be late January, early February." Evelyn was crying again, but this time with pure joy. She squeezed Daniel's hand so hard it hurt, and he squeezed back, anchoring them both to this moment. "That's our baby," she whispered. "That's really our baby." "Yeah," Daniel managed, his voice thick. "That's our baby." They left the doctor's office in a daze, walking to their cars without speaking, both trying to process what they'd just seen. At Evelyn's car, she turned to him with a question in her eyes. "What now?" she asked. "Now we tell Miles," Daniel said, "and we start getting ready. We have about 7 months to figure out how to make this work." "I'm scared," Evelyn admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if I lose this baby too?" "We can't think like that," Daniel said, though the same fear had been clawing at his chest since she'd said the word pregnant. "We take it one day at a time. We follow the doctor's orders, and we hope." "Hope," Evelyn repeated. I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. That evening, Daniel sat Miles down and told him the news. His son's face cycled through surprise, excitement, and concern before settling on cautious happiness. "So in like 7 months, I'll have a brother or sister?" Miles asked. "That's right. And they'll live across the street with Evelyn?" "We'll work out the details, but probably yes, at least some of the time." Miles nodded slowly. "Okay, that's pretty cool, I guess." "Just pretty cool?" Daniel asked, smiling. "I mean, it'll be cooler when they're old enough to actually do stuff. Babies are kind of boring." "Fair point." Miles was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Daniel had been dreading. "Dad, does this mean you and Evelyn are going to get married?" "Nobody. We're friends, and we're going to be co-parents, but we're not getting married." "Why not? Jeremy said his parents said it's weird that you're having a baby together if you're not married." Daniel felt a flash of anger at the neighbors who were apparently discussing his personal life, but he pushed it down. "People are going to have opinions about what we're doing. Some of them will think it's weird or wrong. But what matters is that we're doing what's right for us, and for this baby, and for you. We're creating a family, just not in the traditional way. So we'll be like a different kind of family?" "Exactly." Miles seemed satisfied with this answer. "Okay, can I tell my friends?" "You can tell whoever you want." The pregnancy progressed through the summer with the surreal quality of a dream Daniel couldn't quite believe was real. Evelyn's morning sickness hit hard in the 2nd month, and Daniel found himself running across the street at odd hours with ginger ale and crackers, holding her hair back while she was sick, learning more about the physical realities of pregnancy than he'd ever known with Sarah. He accompanied her to every doctor's appointment, watched the baby grow from a flickering heartbeat to a recognizable shape with tiny fingers and toes. In the 4th month, they learned they were having a girl, and Evelyn cried for an hour straight, overcome with the painful joy of having a daughter again. "I don't want to replace Sophie," she said through her tears. "I could never replace her." "You're not replacing her," Daniel said gently. "You're honoring her by living again, by being a mother again. That's not replacement, that's survival." Miles became increasingly invested in the pregnancy, asking questions about when the baby would arrive, what they'd name her, whether she'd like Legos. He started reading books about being a big brother, practicing his patience with a kind of earnest determination that made Daniel's chest ache with pride. But as the pregnancy became more visible, the questions from neighbors and acquaintances became more pointed. Daniel's parents called weekly, still trying to understand their son's decision, offering support tinged with concern. The woman at the grocery store asked if congratulations were in order for him and his girlfriend. The guy who ran the hardware store made a joke about making honest women out of people that Daniel chose to ignore. Through it all, Daniel and Evelyn maintained their boundary. They were friends, co-parents, two people building something unconventional but real. They had dinner together several times a week, often with Miles joining them. They talked about nursery colors and childcare arrangements and how to split middle-of-the-night feedings. They navigated the 1,000 small decisions that came with preparing for a child. But they weren't in love. They didn't pretend to be. And Daniel told himself that was fine, that their friendship was enough foundation for what they were building. He told himself that until one evening in late August when everything changed. Evelyn had invited Daniel and Miles over for dinner. Her first real attempt at cooking in months after morning sickness had finally subsided. Miles was in the backyard examining something in the garden with the intense focus he brought to anything nature-related, and Daniel was helping Evelyn set the table. She reached up to get plates from a high shelf, and her shirt rode up, exposing the curve of her pregnant belly. Daniel's hand moved without thought, reaching out to touch, and he felt the baby kick against his palm. "She's active tonight," Evelyn said, smiling down at his hand on her stomach. Daniel looked up and found Evelyn watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The moment stretched, heavy with something unspoken, and he became suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of her skin under his palm, of the life they'd created together moving beneath his touch. "Daniel," Evelyn said softly, and there was a question in the way she said his name. He should have stepped back, should have broken the moment before it became something they couldn't take back. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, his hand on her belly, his eyes locked on hers, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. They'd been so careful to keep things platonic, to maintain the boundaries that made their arrangement safe and manageable. But standing here with his hand on her pregnant stomach, feeling their daughter move, looking into Evelyn's eyes and seeing the same confusion and longing reflected back at him, Daniel realized they'd been lying to themselves. Somewhere between that first desperate conversation and this moment, something had changed. Friendship had deepened into something else, something that terrified him because it was exactly what they'd agreed not to pursue. "This wasn't part of the plan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know." Evelyn's hand covered his, holding it against her belly. "But maybe the plan changed." "Evelyn! Dad!" Miles's voice called from the backyard. "Come look at this weird bug." The spell broke. Daniel stepped back, his hand falling away, and Evelyn turned to the stove, her face flushed. They moved around each other carefully for the rest of the evening, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every loaded glance. That night, alone in his house after Miles had gone to bed, Daniel sat in the darkness and forced himself to confront what he'd been avoiding for months. He was falling in love with Evelyn more, not because of the baby, not out of obligation or proximity, but because of who she was. The way she listened to Miles's endless questions without ever getting impatient, the way she laughed at terrible jokes and cried at insurance commercials, the way she'd faced pregnancy with such courage despite her fear of loss, the way she'd slowly come back to life over the past months, shedding grief like old skin and allowing herself to hope again. He loved her, and that changed everything. Because loving her meant their arrangement was no longer simple. It meant the potential for real hurt if things went wrong. It meant Miles could lose another mother figure if the relationship failed. It meant Daniel would have to risk his heart again, and he'd spent 5 years building walls specifically to avoid that risk. The smart thing would be to ignore these feelings, to maintain the boundaries they'd established, to be co-parents and nothing more. But Daniel was tired of being smart, tired of playing it safe, tired of protecting himself from pain by refusing to let himself feel anything real. 3 days later, with his heart pounding and his palms sweating, Daniel knocked on Evelyn's door at 9 in the evening. She answered in pajamas, her pregnant belly prominent under an oversized t-shirt, her face free of makeup. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concern crossing her features. "Is Miles Miles is fine, Daniel interrupted. He's asleep. I need to talk to you about something. Evelyn stepped back, letting him in. They moved to the living room and Daniel paced while she sat on the couch, watching him with growing alarm. You're scaring me, she said. What's wrong? Daniel stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her, and made himself say the words before courage failed him. I'm in love with you. Evelyn's face went absolutely still. What? I'm in love with you, Daniel repeated, the words coming easier the second time. I don't know when it happened, probably gradually over the past months, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just a friendship or a co-parenting arrangement. It's more than that. At least for me, it's more than that. Daniel, I know this wasn't the plan, he continued, words tumbling out now that he'd started. I know we agreed to keep things platonic, to be friends raising a child together, but I can't help how I feel, and I can't keep lying about it. So I'm telling you now, and if you don't feel the same way, that's okay. We can figure out how to move forward as friends. But I needed you to know. Evelyn sat frozen, her hands resting on her pregnant belly, her face cycling through shock and confusion and something that might have been fear. The silence stretched so long, Daniel started to regret every word he'd just said. Say something, he finally pleaded, even if it's just to tell me I'm an idiot. You're not an idiot, Evelyn said slowly. But you're also not the only one who's been lying. Daniel's heart stopped. What? She stood up, moving toward him with the careful grace of someone navigating an unfamiliar body. I've been terrified to admit this, even to myself, because it felt like a betrayal of Michael. Like I was replacing him, or forgetting him, or being disloyal to his memory. Evelyn. But the truth is, she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. The truth is, I started falling for you months ago. Maybe when you held my hand through that first ultrasound. Maybe when you sat with me in the rain after another negative test. Maybe even earlier, that first night when I knocked on your door and you didn't turn me away despite how crazy my request was. Daniel felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. You have feelings for me? I'm in love with you, Evelyn said, and the words hit him like a physical force. I love how patient you are with Miles, how you fix broken things without expecting thanks, how you've held me through every disappointment without making me feel weak. I love your terrible coffee and your worst singing and the way you always put others before yourself. I love you, and it terrifies me, because what if I screw this up? What if loving you means losing you, and I can't survive another loss? Daniel closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands, wiping away tears with his thumbs. You're not going to lose me. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. But I can promise that I'm all in, that I want this, want us, to be more than just a co-parenting arrangement. I want to try being an actual family, you and me and Miles and this little girl we're about to bring into the world. What if it doesn't work? Evelyn whispered. What if we try and fail and ruin everything we've built? Then at least we tried, Daniel said. At least we were brave enough to reach for something real instead of hiding behind safe boundaries. Evelyn searched his face, and Daniel saw the moment she decided to trust, to hope, to take the leap with him. She rose on her toes and kissed him, and it was nothing like the clinical encounters of their conception attempts. This was real and messy and full of all the emotion they'd been holding back for months. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn rested her forehead against his. So what now? She asked. Now we figure it out together, Daniel said. One day at a time, one decision at a time. No more pretending this is just a practical arrangement. We're building something real, and that means being honest about what we feel. I can do honest, Evelyn said. I'm tired of hiding anyway. They stood there in her living room, holding each other while their daughter kicked between them, and Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years, complete. The morning after their confession found Daniel sitting at his kitchen table with Miles, trying to figure out how to explain that everything had changed and nothing had changed simultaneously. His son was working through a bowl of cereal with single-minded focus, oblivious to the internal crisis his father was navigating. So, buddy, Daniel started, then stopped, reorganizing his thoughts. You know how Evelyn and I have been friends, and we're having a baby together. Miles looked up, milk dripping from his spoon. Yeah? Well, we've decided we want to be more than friends. Like, actually together. Dating, I guess you'd call it. Miles set down his spoon carefully, his young face serious. Does that mean she's going to be like my stepmom or something? Eventually, maybe, if things work out. But we're taking it slow, figuring things out as we go. Okay. Miles picked up his spoon again. Does this mean she'll move in here? The question caught Daniel off guard. They hadn't discussed logistics, hadn't talked about anything beyond the raw admission of feelings. I don't know. We haven't gotten that far yet. She should move in here, Miles said with the confidence of someone who'd clearly given this thought. Her house is nice, but ours has the better garage for your work, and the backyard is bigger for when the baby gets old enough to play. Plus, all my stuff is here. Daniel smiled despite himself. Those are good points. I'll mention them to Evelyn. Cool. Miles returned to his cereal, the conversation apparently resolved in his mind. Then he looked up again. Dad, are you happy? Like, for real happy? The question hit Daniel squarely in the chest. Yeah, buddy, for real happy. A little scared too, but mostly happy. Good, Miles said simply. You deserve to be happy. Out of the mouths of children, Daniel thought, came the wisdom adults spent years trying to relearn. He reached across the table and ruffled his son's hair, overwhelmed with gratitude for this kid who'd weathered so much change with such grace. That afternoon, Daniel crossed the street to find Evelyn standing in what would become the nursery, staring at paint swatches with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. She looked up when he entered, and the smile that crossed her face made his heart skip. I can't decide between gentle cream and whisper white, she said, holding up two swatches that looked identical to Daniel's untrained eye. What do you think? I think they're both white, he said honestly. They're completely different, Evelyn insisted. One has warm undertones, the other is cooler. It changes the whole feel of the room. Daniel crossed to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his hands on her belly. Whatever you pick, will be perfect. She leaned back against him. Miles okay with the news? Better than okay. He suggested you move in here, actually. Made some very practical arguments about garage space and yard size. Evelyn turned in his arms to face him. He did? He did. And I've been thinking, he might be right. Not immediately, but eventually. It doesn't make sense to raise a baby between two houses when we could all be under one roof. That's a big step, Evelyn said carefully. Are you sure? I'm sure I want to build a life with you, Daniel said. The logistics we can figure out. But yeah, eventually, I'd like us all to be together. One family, one home. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, which seemed to be her default state lately. I'd like that too. But Daniel, I need to know, are you doing this because you love me or because you feel obligated? Because of the baby? Look at me. Daniel waited until she met his eyes. The baby is part of this, yes, but I'm not with you out of obligation. I'm with you because you make me laugh when I'm stressed, because you listen to Miles's terrible jokes like they're the funniest things you've ever heard, because you've fought your way through grief and come out stronger. I'm with you because I choose to be, every single day. Every single day sounds like a lot of days, Evelyn said, but she was smiling. Well, we can start with today and see how it goes. They spent the afternoon painting the nursery in whisper white, which Evelyn insisted was the right choice despite Daniel's colorblindness to the difference. Miles joined them after school, offering commentary and getting more paint on himself than the walls. They ordered pizza for dinner and ate it sitting on the floor of the half-finished nursery, surrounded by paint cans and drop cloths, and Daniel thought this might be what contentment felt like. The next few weeks settled into a new normal that felt both strange and right. Daniel and Evelyn were officially together, though they moved cautiously, aware that they were building something that affected more than just themselves. They had dinner together most nights, alternating between houses. Daniel would hold Evelyn when the pregnancy discomfort kept her awake, rubbing her back and talking about nothing until she drifted off. She'd sit with Miles and help him with homework while Daniel finished repair jobs in the garage. They were becoming a unit, this odd little family assembled from broken pieces and held together by hope and stubbornness. but doubt crept in during quiet moments, usually late at night when Daniel lay awake and wondered if he was being fair to anyone involved. Was he being fair to Miles, asking him to accept another mother figure who might leave? Was he being fair to Evelyn, loving her when part of his heart would always belong to Sarah? Was he being fair to their unborn daughter, bringing her into a situation so unconventional it defied easy explanation? One particularly bad night in September, Daniel found himself standing at his bedroom window at 2 in the morning, staring across at Evelyn's dark house and spiraling into panic. What if this was all a mistake? What if loving Evelyn meant dishonoring Sarah's memory? What if he was terrible at being in a relationship after 5 years of being alone? His phone buzzed with a text. From Evelyn. "Can't sleep. You up?" Daniel smiled despite his anxiety and texted back, "Yeah, want company? Please." He crossed the street in his pajamas, let himself in with the key she'd given him, and found her on the couch wrapped in a blanket despite the warm night. She looked exhausted and beautiful and 7 months pregnant, and Daniel felt his doubts quiet in the face of how right it felt to be near her. "Can't turn your brain off?" he asked, sitting beside her. "She's dancing on my bladder, my back hurts, and I keep having this nightmare where I go into labor and forget how to breathe." Evelyn leaned against his shoulder. "Also, I'm terrified we're making a huge mistake." "Which mistake specifically? We've made several." "This one. Us. What if we're just two lonely people who convinced ourselves we're in love because it's convenient?" Daniel had wondered the same thing, had interrogated his feelings from every angle trying to find the lie, but he kept coming back to the same truth. "Do you feel like you're settling? Like you're with me because I'm just available?" "No," Evelyn said immediately. "I feel like I'm with you because you're you, because you make me feel safe and seen and like maybe I deserve to be happy again." Then we're not settling," Daniel said. "We're choosing. There's a difference." "But what about Sarah? Don't you feel guilty?" The question landed hard because yes, he did feel guilty sometimes. Guilty for moving on, guilty for loving someone new, guilty for being happy when Sarah never got that chance. But he'd also spent enough nights talking to her memory to know what she'd say. "Sarah would want me to live," Daniel said quietly. "She made me promise, near the end, that I wouldn't spend the rest of my life being alone out of some misguided loyalty to her. She said I deserved love, and Miles deserved to see his father happy. So yeah, sometimes I feel guilty. But then I remember that promise, and I choose to believe that loving you doesn't diminish what I had with her." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "Michael would probably say the same thing. He was always telling me to take risks, to not play it safe all the time. I think he'd like you." "Yeah?" "Yeah. He'd appreciate how you fix things, how you're patient with Miles, how you make terrible coffee but refuse to acknowledge it." "My coffee is perfectly fine." "Your coffee tastes like motor oil." "You're very critical for someone seeking comfort in the middle of the night." Evelyn laughed, and the sound eased something in Daniel's chest. They sat together in the darkness, and he felt their daughter moving against his hand where it rested on Evelyn's belly, and the doubts receded again. This was real. Complicated and unconventional and sometimes terrifying, but real. October brought cooler weather and the reality that they had less than 4 months before their daughter arrived. Daniel and Evelyn spent a weekend shopping for baby furniture, arguing good-naturedly about whether they needed a fancy stroller or if a basic one would suffice, debating the merits of various car seat brands with the intensity of people who understood how high the stakes were. Miles came along and provided running commentary on everything, declaring most of it boring until they reached the toy section, where he insisted his future sister would definitely need the elaborate play gym he'd spotted. "She won't be able to use that for at least a year," Evelyn pointed out. "Then we're planning ahead," Miles said with unassailable logic. They bought the play gym. That night, after Miles had gone to bed, Daniel and Evelyn assembled the crib in what had been Daniel's guest room and was slowly transforming into a nursery. They worked in comfortable silence, Daniel reading instructions while Evelyn handed him parts, and he marveled at how domestic this felt, how normal, despite the extraordinarily abnormal circumstances that had brought them here. "We need to pick a name," Evelyn said as Daniel tightened the last screw. "We can't keep calling her the baby forever." They'd been avoiding this conversation, both acutely aware of the weight it carried. Evelyn wanted to honor Sophie somehow, without making it feel like replacement. Daniel wanted something that felt like a new beginning, not an echo of the past. "What about Emma?" Evelyn suggested. "It means universal or whole, and it was my grandmother's name." Daniel tested the name silently. Emma Harper. Emma Moore Harper? They hadn't even discussed last names yet, another conversation they'd been skirting. "Emma's good," he said. "But what about the middle name?" "Rose?" Evelyn offered. "Sophie loved roses. It would be a way to honor her without making it feel like we're trying to bring her back." Daniel finished. "I think Sophie would like that." Emma Rose. Evelyn tested the name, her hand on her belly. "What do you think, little one? Are you an Emma?" As if in response, the baby kicked hard enough that Daniel saw Evelyn's stomach shift. They both laughed, and it felt like confirmation, like their daughter was already making her presence known. "Emma Rose it is," Daniel said, and felt another piece of their future click into place. But the peace was short-lived. A week later, Daniel's mother called with news that she and his father were coming to visit. Not asking, informing. They'd be there in 2 weeks and planned to stay for several days because they wanted to see what this situation really looked like before their granddaughter arrived. Daniel broke the news to Evelyn over dinner and watched her face cycle through panic and determination. "They think we're making a mistake," she said, not asking. "They think I'm rushing into something complicated without thinking it through," Daniel corrected. Which, to be fair, is kind of accurate. "We thought it through," Evelyn protested. "We set boundaries and made agreements and then fell in love and threw most of those boundaries out the window," Daniel finished. "I know. But my parents are traditional people, Evelyn. They're still processing that their son is having a baby with someone he's not married to. Do they think I trapped you?" Evelyn's voice was small. "That I manipulated you into this?" "No." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. "They think I'm trying to fix you the way I fix broken appliances, and that it's going to blow up in my face. But they don't know you. Once they meet you, really meet you, they'll understand." "What if they don't?" "Then they don't," Daniel said firmly. "I'm not asking for their permission, Evelyn. I'm 38 years old and perfectly capable of making my own decisions. But I'd like their support, and I think once they see us together, they'll give it." The 2 weeks before his parents' arrival were a flurry of preparation. Daniel deep-cleaned his house with the kind of intensity usually reserved for military inspections. Evelyn stress-baked enough cookies to feed a small army. Miles, sensing the tension, asked repeatedly if he was going to get in trouble with his grandparents for being okay with the whole situation. "Nobody's in trouble, son," Daniel assured him for the 5th time. "Grandma and Grandpa just want to make sure everyone's happy and healthy." "We are happy and healthy," Miles pointed out. "So what's the problem?" "Adults make things complicated," Daniel said. "You'll understand when you're older. That's what you always say when you don't want to explain something. Because it's always true." The day his parents arrived, Daniel picked them up from the airport with his stomach in knots. His mother embraced him tightly, then held him at arm's length to study his face. "You look tired," she declared. "Hello to you too, Mom." "Janet, give the boy a chance to breathe," Daniel's father said, pulling him into a hug. "How's Miles?" "Great. He's at home with Evelyn, actually. They're making dinner." His mother's eyebrows rose. "She's already at your house? How serious is this, Daniel?" "Serious enough that we're having a baby together, Mom. I told you that." "You told us you were helping her have a baby," his mother corrected. "You didn't mention you were in a relationship." "It's evolved," Daniel said, loading their luggage into his truck. "Things are different than they were when we started." The drive home was tense, his mother asking pointed questions about Evelyn's background, her finances, her intentions. Daniel answered as patiently as he could, but by the time they pulled into his driveway, his jaw was clenched tight enough to ache. "Just meet her," he said as they got out. "Actually talk to her before you judge the situation." Inside, Evelyn and Miles were setting the table, and Daniel saw his son light up at the sight of his grandparents. The reunion was enthusiastic on Miles's part, more reserved from Janet and Robert Harper as they took in the scene. This pregnant woman in their son's kitchen, moving around with the familiarity of someone who belonged there. "Mom, Dad, this is Evelyn Moore," Daniel said. "Evelyn, my parents Janet and Robert." Evelyn wiped her hands on a towel and extended one to Janet. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you. Daniel's told me so much about you." Janet shook her hand with visible reservation. "I wish we could say the same, but Daniel's been somewhat sparse with details." "Mom," Daniel's voice carried a warning. "It's okay," Evelyn said, though Daniel could see the hurt in her eyes. "I understand this is an unusual situation. You have questions, concerns. That's completely natural." "Grandma, Grandpa, come see the nursery." Miles grabbed his grandmother's hand. "We painted it whisper white, which looks exactly like regular white, but Evelyn says it's different. And we got a crib with this cool thing that converts it into a toddler bed later, and—" Miles's enthusiasm was infectious enough that Janet allowed herself to be dragged upstairs, Robert following with an amused expression. Daniel waited until they were out of earshot before turning to Evelyn. "I'm sorry. She's just protective. She thinks I'm using you," Evelyn said quietly. I could see it in her face. "She doesn't know you yet. Give her time." Dinner was awkward, conversation stilted despite Miles's best efforts to fill the silences with stories about school and his friends and the baby sister he was excited to meet. Janet asked Evelyn careful questions about her work, her background, her plans for raising a child. Each question felt like a test Evelyn wasn't sure how to pass. Finally, as they cleared the dishes, Robert spoke up. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly. You two decided to have a child together while you were just friends, and then somewhere along the way, you fell in love." "That's right," Daniel said. "And you're planning to raise this baby together, even though you're not married?" "We haven't discussed marriage yet," Evelyn said. "We're taking things one step at a time." Janet set down her fork with more force than necessary. "Daniel, can I speak with you privately?" They went out to the back porch, leaving Evelyn and Robert to make awkward small talk. Janet wasted no time once the door closed. "Are you out of your mind?" she demanded. "You barely know this woman, and you're bringing a child into the world with her?" "I know her plenty, Mom. We've spent nearly a year getting to know each other." "A year is nothing. Sarah was in your life for 10 years before she passed, and you think you can build something real with a stranger in 12 months? The comparison to Sarah hit Daniel like a slap. Evelyn is not a stranger, and she's not Sarah, and I'm not trying to replace Sarah. I'm trying to build a life with someone who understands loss and grief and what it means to keep going when everything's fallen apart. She could be using you," Janet said, softer now, "using you for stability, for a father for her child. How do you know her feelings are real?" "How did you know Dad's feelings were real when you married him?" Daniel countered. "How does anyone know? You take a leap of faith and trust that the other person will catch you. But you have Miles to think about. If this falls apart, I'll handle it," Daniel said firmly. "Just like I handled Sarah's death, just like I've handled every hard thing that's come my way. I'm not a child, Mom. I'm a grown man making choices about my own life, and I need you to respect that." Janet's eyes filled with tears. "I just don't want to see you hurt again. Or Miles. You've both been through so much." "I know." Daniel's anger softened. "But I can't live in fear of being hurt. That's not living, that's just existing. And I'm tired of just existing." They stood in silence for a moment before Janet spoke again. "Tell me about her, really tell me. What do you love about her?" So Daniel did. He told his mother about Evelyn's strength, about how she'd survived an unimaginable loss and still had the courage to hope for a future. He told her about the way Evelyn listened to Miles, like everything he said mattered, about her terrible baking that she kept attempting despite consistent failure, about her laugh that sounded like it surprised her every time. He told her about the quiet moments when Evelyn would rest her hand on her belly and talk to their daughter, about the way she cried at insurance commercials and nature documentaries, and sometimes just because the sunset was particularly beautiful. By the time he finished, Janet was crying openly. "You really love her," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I really do." "And she loves you?" "She says she does." "And I believe her." Janet wiped her eyes. "Then I'll try. I can't promise I won't worry because I'm your mother and that's what we do. But I'll try to trust your judgment. They went back inside to find Robert and Evelyn deep in conversation about database architecture, which apparently Robert knew something about from his years in IT management. Miles had abandoned them to play video games, and the atmosphere had thawed considerably. Over the next few days, Daniel watched his mother slowly warm to Evelyn. They cooked together, shopped for baby clothes together, and had long conversations on the porch that Daniel wasn't privy to. By the fourth day, he found them laughing together over coffee, and something tight in his chest finally relaxed. The night before his parents left, Janet pulled Daniel aside one more time. "I was wrong about her," she admitted. "She's not using you. If anything, I think she's still surprised that you want to be with her." "She's been hurt badly," Daniel said. "It's hard for her to trust that good things can happen." "Take care of her," Janet said, "and that granddaughter of mine, and yourself, in that order." "Yes, ma'am." "And Daniel, when you're ready, you should marry her. Not because you have to, but because it's clear you want to. Don't let fear or grief or whatever else is holding you back stop you from claiming that happiness." The thought had crossed Daniel's mind more than once, but hearing his mother say it made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Marriage. A real permanent commitment beyond just co-parenting. The idea terrified and excited him in equal measure. November arrived with the first real cold snap of the season, and Evelyn was officially 8 months pregnant, uncomfortable and impatient and desperate to meet their daughter. She'd moved most of her essentials to Daniel's house without them explicitly discussing it, and Daniel woke up one morning to realize she'd spent the last week sleeping in his bed, eating meals at his table, and he couldn't remember the last time she'd spent a full night at her own place. "I think you live here now," he said one morning over breakfast. Evelyn looked around the kitchen as if noticing for the first time. "I think I do. Is that okay?" "More than okay," Daniel said, "but we should probably make it official. Lease out your place, combine our stuff properly, make this actually ours instead of yours and mine." "That's a big step." "We're having a baby together in about 6 weeks. I think the big step already happened." Evelyn smiled. "Fair point." "Okay, let's make it official." They spent the next week merging households properly, which meant arguments about furniture placement and kitchen organization and whether Evelyn's terrible taste in decorative pillows would be allowed to contaminate Daniel's perfectly functional couch. They compromised, negotiated, and occasionally declared each other impossible, but by the end of it, the house felt like it belonged to both of them. Miles declared the whole process boring until Evelyn set up a reading nook in what had been empty corner, complete with beanbag chairs and good lighting and a bookshelf he could actually reach. Then he decided maybe combining households wasn't so terrible after all. December brought preparation of a different kind. They had everything ready for Emma's arrival, the nursery complete, the car seat installed, the hospital bag packed. But Daniel still felt unprepared, still woke up in the middle of the night wondering if he was ready to be a father to a newborn again after 9 years. "You're going to be great," Evelyn assured him for the 100th time as they lay in bed one night, her back against his chest as he rubbed her aching shoulders. "You're already great with Miles. Miles is 9. He can feed himself and use the bathroom and sleep through the night. Emma is going to be completely helpless. And you're going to handle it beautifully." Evelyn turned in his arms to face him. "Daniel, you're the most capable person I know. You can fix anything, solve any problem, adapt to any situation. You're going to be an amazing father to her." "What if I love her differently than I love Miles? What if I can't love her as much because she's not Sarah's child?" The fear had been eating at him for weeks, this terrible worry that his capacity for love was limited, that he'd used it all up on Miles and Sarah and had nothing left for this new little person. Evelyn cupped his face in her hands. "The heart doesn't divide love, Daniel. It multiplies. You're not taking love away from Miles to give to Emma. You're creating new love, and it's going to be just as strong and just as real. Different, maybe, because she's a different person, but not less." "How do you know?" "Because I love Sophie with everything I had, and I still have room to love Emma, and you, and Miles. The heart is more resilient than we give it credit for." Daniel kissed her, pouring into it all the gratitude and love and hope he couldn't quite articulate. When they pulled apart, Evelyn was smiling. "We're going to be okay," she said. "All of us. We're going to figure this out together." And lying there in the darkness with their daughter moving between them and Miles sleeping peacefully down the hall, Daniel chose to believe her. Emma rose. Harper arrived 3 weeks early on a clear January morning in a rush that left everyone scrambling. Evelyn's water broke at 5:30 while she was making coffee, and by 6 they were racing to the hospital with Miles still in his pajamas in the back seat, clutching the stuffed bear he'd bought for his sister and looking equal parts excited and terrified. "Dad, you're going like 90 miles an hour," Miles pointed out as Daniel took a corner faster than he should have. "Hospital emergencies allow for speed," Daniel said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Are you freaking out?" Miles asked. "Completely." "Me too." In the passenger seat, Evelyn breathed through a contraction and somehow still managed to laugh. "You two are supposed to be reassuring me, not panicking together." "We can multitask," Daniel said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Panic and reassure simultaneously." They made it to the hospital with time to spare, though Daniel's heart didn't stop racing until they had Evelyn settled in a delivery room, and a nurse had assured him that everything looked normal and healthy. Miles stayed in the waiting room with Daniel's mother, who'd driven down the week before just in case, and Daniel held Evelyn's hand through contractions that grew stronger and closer together until there was barely any rest between them. "I can't do this." Evelyn gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. "I changed my mind. I don't want to do this anymore." "You're doing it," Daniel said, wiping sweat from her forehead with a cool cloth. "You're doing amazing." "I'm not. I'm terrible at this." "Why did we think this was a good idea?" "Because we wanted Emma. And in about an hour we're going to meet her." "An hour?" Evelyn looked at him with wild eyes. "The doctor said 4 more hours." "Doctors lie to keep people calm," Daniel said. "Trust me, she's coming soon. I can feel it." He was right. 45 minutes later, after pushing that made Evelyn scream words Daniel had never heard her use, Emma Rose Harper entered the world with a cry that filled the delivery room and Daniel's heart simultaneously. The nurse placed her on Evelyn's chest, this tiny, perfect creature with a shocking amount of dark hair and lungs that worked remarkably well. Evelyn was crying, Daniel was crying, and Emma was screaming her displeasure at having been evicted from her comfortable home. "She's perfect," Evelyn sobbed, her hands shaking as she touched their daughter's face. "Daniel, look at her. She's perfect." Daniel couldn't speak, could only stare at this miracle they'd created through hope and stubbornness and sheer force of will. Emma's tiny fingers wrapped around his index finger, and something in his chest cracked open, all his fears about not being able to love her dissolving in the face of the overwhelming emotion that flooded through him. This was his daughter, his child, and he loved her with an intensity that took his breath away. "Hi, Emma," he managed, his voice rough. "Welcome to the world, sweetheart. We've been waiting for you." Emma stopped crying at the sound of his voice, her unfocused eyes turning toward him, and Daniel felt the last piece of his heart that had been locked away since Sarah's death finally open. After the nurses had cleaned Emma and checked her vitals and declared her healthy, they brought Miles in to meet his sister. He approached the hospital bed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, his eyes huge as he stared at the tiny bundle in Evelyn's arms. "She's so small," he whispered. "I thought she'd be bigger." "You were this small once," Daniel said, putting his arm around his son's shoulders. "Hard to believe, I know." "Can I hold her?" Evelyn looked to Daniel, who nodded. They positioned Miles carefully in the chair, supporting his arms, and then placed Emma in them. Miles stared down at his sister with an expression of pure wonder. "Hi, Emma," he said softly. "I'm your big brother Miles. I'm going to teach you about dinosaurs and space and how to ride a bike when you're old enough. And I'll protect you from bullies and help you with homework and make sure nobody's ever mean to you." Daniel felt his throat tighten at the fierce protectiveness in his son's voice. Miles had lost his mother, had lived through years of just him and his dad, had weathered so much change with such grace, and now he was making promises to his baby sister with the solemn certainty of someone who intended to keep them. "You're going to be the best big brother," Evelyn said, wiping tears from her own eyes. "I know," Miles said simply, then looked up at Daniel. "Dad, can we keep her?" The laugh that burst from Daniel was half sob. Yeah, buddy, we can keep her. They stayed in the hospital for 2 days, learning to navigate the chaos of a newborn. Emma had strong opinions about everything. She didn't like having her diaper changed, loved being held skin to skin, and had a cry that could wake the dead when she was hungry. Daniel found himself falling back into patterns he'd nearly forgotten. The automatic sway that soothed a fussy baby, the way to support her neck, the precise angle needed to get a good burp. Evelyn was exhausted and sore and radiant, completely in love with their daughter despite the lack of sleep and the physical trauma of delivery. Daniel watched her with Emma and saw the grief finally start to release its stranglehold. She wasn't forgetting Sophie. She'd never forget Sophie. But she was allowing herself to be a mother again without the crushing weight of guilt. On their second night in the hospital, after Emma had finally fallen asleep in the bassinet and Evelyn was dozing in the bed, Daniel stood at the window looking out at the city lights and felt Sarah's presence so strongly it was almost physical. I did it, he whispered to her memory. I moved on, like you asked. I let myself love again. And I hope, you'd be proud of the family we've built. He didn't expect an answer, didn't need one. The peace he felt was answer enough. They brought Emma home to a house that had been transformed by Daniel's mother into something resembling a functional nursery. She'd stocked the fridge, done all the laundry, and set up a rotation of meals from neighbors who'd heard about the baby and wanted to help. Miles had made a welcome home banner that hung crooked over the doorway, decorated with drawings of what he insisted were butterflies but looked more like colorful blobs. The first week was brutal. Emma woke every 2 hours like clockwork, screaming for food with an intensity that seemed impossible from such a small creature. Daniel and Evelyn took shifts, stumbling through the exhaustion in a haze of diapers and burp cloths, and trying to remember when they'd last showered. Miles helped where he could, fetching clean clothes and singing to Emma when she was fussy and accepting the chaos with the resilience of someone who was already adapting to his new normal. On the 6th night, Daniel found Evelyn crying in the nursery at 3 a.m, Emma finally asleep in her arms after an hour of screaming. I can't do this, Evelyn whispered when Daniel appeared in the doorway. I'm so tired I can't think straight, and she won't stop crying, and I'm terrified I'm going to mess her up somehow. Daniel crossed to them and gently took Emma, settling her in the crib before pulling Evelyn into his arms. You're doing great, better than great. You're exhausted because you're doing everything right, caring for her constantly, putting her needs first. But what if it's not enough? Evelyn sobbed into his chest. What if I'm not enough? You are enough, Daniel said firmly. You're more than enough, and you're not doing this alone. We're a team, remember? You and me and Miles, all of us figuring this out together. I miss sleeping, Evelyn said, which made Daniel laugh despite the exhaustion weighing on his own shoulders. I know, me too, but it gets better, I promise, it gets better. And slowly, it did. By the 3rd week, Emma started sleeping in slightly longer stretches. By the 4th week, they'd established something resembling a routine. By the 6th week, Daniel woke up one morning and realized he'd slept for 4 consecutive hours, which felt like a miracle. Emma grew and changed with startling speed, her personality emerging in small increments. She loved being talked to, her unfocused eyes tracking faces with intense concentration. She had a sweet temperament unless she was hungry, at which point she transformed into a tiny dictator whose demands could not be ignored. She fit perfectly in the crook of Daniel's arm, her weight a constant reminder that they'd actually done it. They'd created this perfect little person. Miles was an exceptional big brother, patient beyond his years. He'd talk to Emma while Daniel made dinner, telling her elaborate stories about space explorers and dinosaur kingdoms. He'd hold her bottle when she was eating, his young face serious with concentration. And when Emma smiled for the first time at 8 weeks old, it was at Miles making ridiculous faces, and his whoop of joy brought both Daniel and Evelyn running. She smiled at me, Miles crowed. Did you see? She smiled right at me. She did, Evelyn confirmed, laughing. I think you're her favorite person. Of course I am, Miles said with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted it. I'm her big brother. Spring arrived slowly, bringing longer days and warmer temperatures, and the kind of hope that only comes after surviving a long winter. Emma was 3 months old, sleeping through most nights. and Daniel had mostly adjusted to functioning on less sleep than he'd thought humanly possible. One evening in late March, after Miles had gone to bed and Emma was sleeping peacefully in her crib, Daniel found Evelyn standing in the backyard watching the sunset. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said finally, "about us, about this family we've built." Daniel's heart kicked up a notch. "Yeah? When this started, I thought I just needed to be a mother again, that filling that hole would be enough to make me whole, but you've given me so much more than that." She turned in his arms to face him. "You've given me a partner, a friend, someone who sees all my broken pieces and doesn't try to fix them, just accepts them as part of who I am." "Evelyn, let me finish." She took a shaky breath. "You've given me Miles, who treats me like I matter even though he didn't have to. You've given me a second chance at happiness I didn't think I deserved. And I know we said we'd take things slow, figure things out as we went. But Daniel, I don't want to take things slow anymore." Daniel's pulse was racing now. "What do you want?" "I want forever," Evelyn said simply. "I want to marry you, officially make this family we've created permanent. I want Miles and Emma to grow up knowing they have two parents who chose each other and chose them. I want to stop being scared of losing this and just live it." Daniel stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. Are you proposing to me?" "I guess I am." Evelyn laughed, tears streaming down her face. "Is that okay? Can women do that?" "Women can absolutely do that," Daniel said, his own eyes burning. "But I had a whole plan, you know. I was going to take you to that Italian restaurant where we had our first real date, and there was going to be a ring and a speech, and I was going to do it right." "You have a ring?" "I've had a ring for 2 months," Daniel admitted. "I've been carrying it around waiting for the perfect moment, and here you are stealing my thunder." Evelyn laughed harder. "So, is that a yes?" "That's absolutely a yes," Daniel said, and kissed her with all the love and relief and joy flooding through him. "Yes to marriage, yes to forever, yes to officially making this weird, wonderful family we've built permanent." They stood in the backyard kissing while the sun set around them, and Daniel thought about how far they'd both come. From that rainy October night when Evelyn knocked on his door with an impossible request to this moment, engaged and in love and parents to 2 incredible children. It shouldn't have worked. By all conventional wisdom, it should have been a disaster, but they'd built something real from their shared grief and desperate hope. They'd chosen each other, day after day, decision after decision, until choosing each other had become as natural as breathing. The wedding happened 2 months later in Daniel's backyard, small and simple and perfect. Just family and a few close friends, Miles serving as ring bearer with Emma in Evelyn's arms as they said their vows. Daniel's parents cried. Evelyn's parents, who'd driven up from California after she finally reached out to rebuild that bridge, cried harder. Miles declared it the best day ever when Daniel officially adopted him to add Harper to his last name, making them all one family legally as well as in spirit. And Emma, 3 months old and oblivious to the significance of the day, slept through the entire ceremony in her grandmother's arms. The years that followed were not without challenges. Emma turned out to be a strong-willed child who had opinions about everything and the lung capacity to express them loudly. Miles navigated the teenage years with varying degrees of success, occasionally resenting his baby sister when she got into his stuff, but fiercely protective when anyone else dared to bother her. There were sleepless nights with sick children, arguments about discipline and screen time, and whose turn it was to handle the 3 a.m. wake-up. There were financial struggles when Daniel's repair business hit a slow patch, and Evelyn had to pick up extra contracts to cover the gap. But there was also laughter, so much laughter. Miles teaching Emma to ride a bike and running alongside her until she found her balance. Family movie nights where they'd argue good-naturedly about what to watch, and always end up with something no one had originally wanted. Sunday morning pancakes that became a tradition, with Emma insisting on helping and getting batter everywhere. Holidays that grew louder and more chaotic as Emma got older and demanded to be included in everything her big brother did. There were quiet moments too. Daniel and Evelyn stealing time alone after the kids were asleep, talking about everything and nothing, still learning new things about each other even years into their marriage. Emma falling asleep between them during thunderstorms, her small body warm and trusting. Miles, even as a teenager, still seeking them out for advice and comfort when the world got too complicated. On Emma's 5th birthday, as Daniel watched her tear into presents with the enthusiasm only a 5-year-old could muster, Miles appeared at his elbow. "You did good, Dad," Miles said quietly. He was 14 now, taller than Daniel and still growing, his voice deeper but his smile the same. "Yeah?" Daniel asked. "Yeah, this—" Miles gestured at the chaos. At Emma demanding cake before dinner. At Evelyn laughing as she tried to maintain some semblance of order. At the life they'd all built together. "This is good. Better than I thought it would be when you first told me about the plan." "You had doubts," Daniel teased. "I had a lot of doubts," Miles admitted, "but you guys proved me wrong. You made it work." Daniel pulled his son into a hug, overwhelmed with gratitude for this kid who'd weathered so much change and come out the other side stronger. "We all made it work. You were part of this from the beginning, Miles. Don't forget that." "I won't," Miles said, then squirmed away with the self-consciousness of a teenager who'd allowed too much emotion to show. "But seriously, can we cut the cake? Emma's about to mutiny." That night, after Emma had finally crashed from her sugar high and Miles had retreated to his room to video chat with friends, Daniel and Evelyn stood in the kitchen doing dishes together. It was mundane, ordinary, the kind of domestic moment that made up the bulk of their lives. But Daniel had learned to find beauty in the ordinary, to appreciate the quiet moments between the chaos. "Happy?" Evelyn asked, handing him a plate to dry. "Incredibly," Daniel said honestly. "You?" "More than I ever thought I'd be again." She paused, then added quietly, "I talked to Sophie today. In my head, I mean. Told her about Emma's birthday, about how she would have loved her little sister." Daniel set down the plate and pulled Evelyn close. "What did she say?" "She said she was glad I found my way back to living." Evelyn's voice was thick with emotion. "That Michael would be happy I found someone who takes care of me the way you do. That they're both proud of the family we've built." "I think they are," Daniel said, meaning it. "I think Sarah's proud too. Proud that I didn't let fear stop me from living, from loving again." They stood together in their kitchen, holding each other while dishes soaked in the sink and their children slept peacefully upstairs, and Daniel marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From grief to hope, from strangers to family, from broken to whole. The road had been unconventional, sometimes terrifying, often uncertain, but they'd walked it together, one step at a time, building something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. Emma's cry broke the moment, not distressed, but the whimpering call of a child who'd woken in an unfamiliar darkness and needed reassurance. Daniel started toward the stairs, but Evelyn stopped him. "I'll go," she said. "You finish the dishes." "Deal." He watched her climb the stairs, heard her soft voice soothing their daughter, and felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was his life now. Not the one he'd planned with Sarah, not the one Evelyn had built with Michael, but something new and equally precious. A family assembled from broken pieces, held together by love and stubborn determination, and the simple choice to keep showing up for each other, day after day after day. When Evelyn came back downstairs, Emma settled and sleeping again, she found Daniel still standing in the kitchen, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How lucky I am," Daniel said simply. "How all of this started with you knocking on my door on a rainy night, asking for something impossible. And somehow, we made it possible." Evelyn crossed to him and took his hands. "We made it more than possible. We made it beautiful." "Yeah," Daniel agreed, pulling her close. "We really did." Years later, when Emma was 10 and Miles was 19 and home from college for the summer, they'd gather around the dinner table for Sunday pancakes, and someone would inevitably ask how Daniel and Evelyn met. And every time they'd exchange a look across the table, an entire conversation passing between them in a glance. Then one of them would start the story. About a single dad who thought his life was already full. About a grieving woman who knocked on a neighbor's door with an impossible request. About the unconventional arrangement that became a friendship, that became a love story, that became a family. Miles would roll his eyes because he'd heard it 1,000 times, but he'd be smiling. Emma would lean forward with rapt attention despite knowing every detail, because it was the story of how she came to exist, and that made it endlessly fascinating. And Daniel would reach across the table to take Evelyn's hand, would look at the life they'd built together, the children, the home, the love that had grown from the smallest seed of hope. And he'd think about that rainy October night 13 years ago when everything changed. He'd think about how close he came to saying no, to staying safe behind his walls, to never taking the risk. And he'd be grateful every single day that he'd chosen to say yes instead. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open the door when someone knocks. Sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes love doesn't look anything like you expected it to, but it's perfect anyway. Their story wasn't conventional, it wasn't neat or simple or easily explained to strangers at parties, but it was theirs, built one choice at a time, one day at a time, one act of courage at a time. A single dad who learned to love again. A grieving mother who found her way back to life. Two children who gained more family than they'd ever imagined. And a house on Riverside Avenue that had started as two separate homes and became one, filled with laughter and love and the beautiful chaos of a family that chose each other. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not how they started, but where they ended up. Not the grief that brought them together, but the love that kept them there. Not the pain of the past, but the hope of the future they built together, one steady step at a time. And on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the house was finally still, Daniel and Evelyn would sit together on the porch and watch the stars, their hands intertwined, their hearts full, their lives complete in ways neither had dared to dream possible. From tragedy to hope, from strangers to soulmates, from broken to whole. This was their story, and it was beautiful.